Chapter 8:26. Reality proved that hot tea seemed to be more effective at calming one's anger than cold tea. After a cup of hot tea, the anger on Chen Yizhang's face immediately subsided. Putting down the teacup, Chen Chong calmly looked at Li Yi and asked, "Then, what has County Marquis Li been busy with these days?" For a moment, Li Yi could not figure out why Chen Chong had revealed all that information. Was it because of the cold tea and hot tea that his brain had become muddled? Or was he purposely giving out false information to disrupt his rhythm? Or was it because he had found his conscience and was heartbroken that he had decided to forsake the darkness for the light? As expected, after saying so much, he was still trying to get information from him. His intentions were extremely bad. Li Yi raised his teacup and smiled. What else could he be busy with? Busy for nothing. Chen Yizhang put down the teacup and took a deep breath. The anger that he had just suppressed seemed to be on the verge of erupting again. Seemingly feeling that the room was stuffy, Chen Chong stood up, pulled aside the heavy curtains by the door, and stood in the corridor. The servants of the Li family had long since cleared away the snow. Although the weather had become increasingly cold, there had been no more snow. Other than some white on the eaves, there was very little snow anywhere else. Chen Chong's breath condensed into white mist in the air as he said with his back to Li Yi. That night, Miaoyu wanted to come and take a look. She thought about it for several days and did not sleep much these past few nights, so she decided to come today. Li Yi looked at the black tiles on the eaves and slowly said, "Third Miss can come here whenever she wants. There is no need to pick a time. But this place is still surnamed Li." Chen Chong turned back to look at him, his eyes unfocused and his expression somewhat perplexed. "Li Yi, County Marquis Li, tell me, what should I do?" At this moment, Chen Chong was something that Li Yi had never seen before. He was ruthless and decisive. This was the impression that Li Yi had of Chen Chong. But at this moment, he truly felt the other's perplexity and hesitation. Although he did not know what he was perplexed about, it was probably an extremely important matter. He could not answer this question. Not far away, the heavy curtain of the room was lifted, and the figure of Third Miss Chen walked out. Chen Chong looked back at Li Yi with a complicated gaze. Then he quickly walked in that direction. However, before he reached the corridor, he suddenly stopped. Because two figures had appeared in front of Third Miss Chen. "May I have a few words with you?" The blind old lady was supported by a woman. Although she couldn't see, she still raised her head. Chen Miaoyu was taken aback for a moment. She asked doubtfully, "I wonder if the old man..." Old mistress lowered her head and said with a trembling voice, "Lady Jade is my daughter." Hearing this name, Chen Miaoyu's body trembled. Her originally rosy complexion turned pale in an instant, and all the blood drained from her face. Chen Chong paled. Just as he was about to go over, a hand pressed down on his shoulder from behind. Li looked ahead and said in a low voice, "She will feel better if we talk things out." As if her soul had been sucked out of her body, she walked into the room in a daze. The name Lady Jade still echoed in Chen Miaoyu's ears. How could she forget this name? How could she dare to forget it? Her husband, her soon-to-be married husband, had held that woman's hand and left her. This name had been forever engraved in her heart. It could never be erased. Every time she touched it, she would feel a pain that was no less painful than when she had carved it with a knife. Two noises came from the front, causing her to snap out of her thoughts at this moment. The old lady and the woman had knelt down in front of her. The old lady's voice was choked with emotion. "Miss, our He family has let you down." Seeing that Chen Chong had suddenly become anxious and was pacing back and forth, his fists clenched so tightly that the veins on his hands were bulging, Li shook his head and said, "Official Chen, would you like to go in for a cup of tea?" Chen Chong impatiently waved his hand. Just as he was about to speak, he suddenly stopped and bowed. This lowly official pays his respects to the princess. The proud Lolita clasped her hands behind her back and walked back in a ladylike manner. She nodded and said, "I have something to say to sir. Go to the side first." "Yes." Hearing this, Chen Chong glanced at Li Yi, then turned and strode away. The proud Lolita skipped over to Li Yi and said, "Sir, I'm not afraid of pain. I've decided. I want to have 2 children in the future, a boy and a girl. It's just right." Crack. Chen Chong, who had been about to walk down the corridor, twisted his leg and stumbled. His entire body rolled down. He curled up on the cold ground and hugged his ankles. The veins on his forehead bulged, and he broke out in a cold sweat. However, he did not care at all. His eyes were wide open as he stared at Li Yi, who was standing on top of him. He could not make a single sound. Aya, what's wrong with Official Chen? How could he be so careless? Li Yi walked over in shock. He waved his hand at a servant of the Li family and ordered, "Quick, quick, call a doctor over." You. Chen Chong's face was filled with shock. In a low voice he said, You're disgraceful." Li Yi frowned and crouched down to look at him. He asked, "Official Chen, what are you saying? How am I disgraceful?" I heard everything just now." Chen Chong's forehead was covered in cold sweat. His face was scrunched up in pain, but he was not talking about his sprained ankle. "The princess said that she wants to give you children too. How could such a private conversation be heard by an outsider?" When the proud Lolita who had followed them heard this, she covered her face and ran away. Li rubbed the space between his brows and said, "The princess is still young. A child's words carry no harm. Official Chen, could it be that you think I'm such an unreasonable person?" The suspicion on Chen Chong's face lessened. Indeed, with the princess's status, if something like that really happened, she would not be standing here talking to him right now. Then his face darkened and he said, "The princess's body is priceless. No matter how close the two of you are, you still have to pay attention to these things. Fortunately, only this official heard it today. If it were to reach His Majesty's ears." These words sounded strange to Li Yi. What did she mean by fortunately? Only he heard it today. This should be counted as unfortunate, right? However, Shaning was used to spouting nonsense. Sometimes, she would not restrain herself in front of the old emperor. Other than herself, no one would take her words seriously. Even so, it was time for him to have a proper talk with her about these matters. If this continued and he encountered people with ulterior motives, they might really accuse him of abducting the princess. Li looked at Chen Chong and nodded. "Official Chen, do not worry. I have always done things with a clear conscience. In the future, I will remind the princess." "Clear conscience?" Chen Chong snorted. "Including the uncooked dumplings that you gave this official and assistant minister Zeng?" Li was startled and asked in surprise, "Uncooked? Let's not bring up the matters of the past in the future. You don't owe me anything, and I don't owe you anything." Inside the room, Chen Miaoyu helped the old man up and calmly said these words. Then, she pushed open the door and walked out. When she saw the situation in the courtyard, her expression changed. She quickly walked over and asked in concern, "Second brother, what's wrong?" Chen Chong gave a dry smile and said, "The road was slippery and I accidentally fell." Crack. The slovenly old man shook his wrist and stood up. "It's just a sprain. It's not a big deal. After you go back and rest for 3 to 5 days, you'll be able to walk normally." Chen Chong touched his ankle in surprise and found that it really didn't hurt anymore. He raised his head and asked, "I can get up now. If you don't feel that your butt is cold, you can lie down a bit longer." The slovenly old man lightly tossed out these words and left with a flick of his sleeve. Li Yi smiled and said, "Our family's physician has a rather bad temper. Please don't mind him." After sending off third young Miss Chun and the limping Chen Chong, he walked back, feeling as if he had forgotten something. At a certain moment he suddenly exclaimed, "My soup!" Fortunately, Xiao Huan was watching and he didn't miss the time. Li scooped a bowl of soup and sat by the bed. After blowing on it to cool it, he fed it to Rui's mouth. Rui opened her mouth a few times, then shook her head and said, "This is so strange. Husband, leave it. I'll do it myself. Be obedient. I rarely feed people soup like this." Li Yi put the spoon to his mouth and blew on it. He said, "If you don't believe me, you can ask Rui. At that time I directly what?" Mississippi Lu walked out from the inner room and scooped a small bowl for herself. She looked at Li Yi and asked, "Directly, yes, directly." Li Yi looked at her as she picked up the spoon and immediately said, "Put it down. This soup, you can't drink this soup." "Why?" Mississippi Lu frowned and looked at him. He couldn't just directly tell her that the greatest effect of this soup was that it was good for breasts and that if she drank it, her breasts would swell. If that happened, he would be labeled as a shameless hooligan. Lee thought for a moment and said, "This soup can only be drunk after having children. Otherwise. Anyway, when you have children in the future, I'll boil it for you." Xiaohuan had already taken a bowl and walked out from the inner room. When she heard the son-in-law say that he couldn't drink this soup before having children, she put the bowl down again. Then she seemed to have thought of something and asked in confusion, "Strange. If second young miss has children, why is son-in-law making soup?" Chapter 827. Second miss had a child. Why did the son-in-law make soup? In the eyes of the little servant girl, this matter was very strange. But after she asked this question, everyone's expression became strange. The son-in-law even slapped her but to stop her from talking nonsense. How was this nonsense? When second miss had a child in the future, things like making soup would naturally be done by her husband. How could it be the son-in-law? Unless, the little servant girl had already walked out of the door, but suddenly stopped. Her pretty face showed a look of realization. Right, in this way, the son-in-law was still the son-in-law. Second miss was still second miss, and it was reasonable for the son-in-law to make soup for second Mississippi. She was originally worried that after second miss got married, she would not be able to see her often. If this was the case, they would still be together in the future. Wouldn't there be nothing to worry about? Thinking of this, the little servant girl's big bright eyes could not help but become brighter, because a problem that had troubled her for a long time seemed to have found a perfect solution. Li found that Xiaohuan had been talking more and more openly recently. She always mentioned the topic of making soup intentionally or unintentionally. Mississippi Lu would not blame her, but the way she looked at him was strange. Although he was open-minded, he could not help but feel guilty when she looked at him like this for a long time. He did not know what she was thinking. Was she worried that he would have any thoughts about her? How could that be possible? She was Lu Rui, the vicious second daughter of the Lu family. She was the biggest evil force in the family. How could he have any thoughts about her? Yes, probably, maybe. Impossible, right? Compared with Mississippi Lu, who became more and more strange and made him feel uncertain, Rui made him feel much more at ease. After all, she was not an ordinary woman. In terms of physique, she was already at the peak of the world's women. In addition, she was nourished by various decoctions. In fact, her body had almost recovered half a month after giving birth. The confinement room was almost airtight. Although she would breathe regularly every day, it would still be stuffy after a long time. She only lived in it for half a month before moving out. Li looked at the little fellow in the swaddling clothes and touched his nose. Although it was only 1 month and he could not even crawl, he would deliberately hide in Rui's arms. Li helped him tuck in the swaddling clothes and whispered, "Dwayner, be a good boy and call me father." Rui could not help laughing and shook her head. "Husband, you are too impatient. How can a child speak so fast?" "At least a few months later he will call me father." Li thought for a moment and suddenly said, "Wife, why don't we bet on whether he learns to call me father or mother first?" A smile appeared on Rui's pretty face and she said, "Then my husband will definitely lose. He has been by my side from morning to night, so he must have learned to call me mother first." "Not necessarily." Li shook his head and said, "This kind of thing still depends on luck." Looking at him, Rui asked, "Then how do you want to bet?" Li thought for a moment and said, "How about the bet? The loser will agree to one condition of the winner." "Okay." Rui did not hesitate either. She looked at him and said, "Husband, you must keep your word." "I will be the judge. I will be the judge." Lolita rolled her eyes and said, "I will be the judge for Sir and Sister Rui." Li patted her head gently and said, "What are you doing? You need a referee to make a bet. Sir, you even let Yong Ning be the referee when we made a bet." The Tsundere Lolita kept shaking her head, then said, "However, the referee can also participate in the bet." Li said helplessly, Okay. You can be the judge if you want." Rui smiled as she watched her run out. She looked down at the swaddling clothes and said in a small voice, "Duaner has fallen asleep again." Li took the little fellow from her arms and put him in the wooden crib. He turned back and said, "You've been holding him for 2 hours. You didn't sleep well last night. Let him sleep. You go rest for a while." Rui shook her head and said, "It's okay. I am not tired. I will stay here and guard him. If he wakes up, there are maids watching here. They will call you when he wakes up." "It's okay." Li shook his head and strode over. He carried her in his arms and walked out of the door. The 2 maids at the door lowered their heads. Rui blushed and whispered, "Husband, there are so many people watching." "So what if there are so many people watching? Can't I hold my own wife?" Li shook his head and kicked open the door of the room next door. He put her on the bed and took off her shoes and coat. Finally, he covered her with a quilt. Li looked at her and whispered, "Sleep. He takes a long nap. He won't wake up for a while." Rui nodded slightly. Her eyelashes blinked a few times and she slowly closed her eyes. Li gently closed the door and stood in the corridor, looking outside. It was the beginning of the 12th lunar month. It had snowed last night, but it was not thick. The old emperor's illness would relapse in winter. It was said that it had worsened these days, and he had been bedridden for several days. It was close to the end of the year, and the academy was closed. The old emperor was bedridden and needed to recuperate. He could not be disturbed. Yongning and Shanning had been staying here these days and only went back at night. Although the old emperor could only live in the warm room, he only needed to endure for another month. If he continued to maintain this state of retirement in the spring of next year, and did not receive any major stimulation, it should not be a big problem to continue living for another year and a half. However, with his physical condition, he should not be able to participate in this year's court meeting. But with Her Royal Highness, it did not matter whether he participated or not. Speaking of Her Royal Highness, Li realized that he had not seen her for a while. The end of the year was approaching. There must be a lot of things to do in the court. The court meeting in half a month's time needed to start preparing now. He thought for a moment and turned his head. He ordered a servant in the corridor, "Prepare the carriage. Let's go to the palace." In front of the Li residence, the carriage slowly moved. After a full quarter of an hour, a small figure slipped into a room. The proud Lolita looked at the sleeping child in the stroller and whispered in a voice that only she could hear, "Dwainer, you have to call Xiaonyang first." Outside the Li residence, a carriage came from a distance and finally stopped. Inside the carriage, Xiao Chui clenched her fists. She turned her head and asked worriedly, "Miss, are we really going in? How about we tell Lily first?" "No need, we are not here to see him." Zheng Zimo shook her head. She grabbed the hem of her clothes with both hands. After loosening her lips, she nodded and said, "Get off the carriage." Inside the residence, a door opened. Rui walked out from inside and asked Xiao Huan, who had just walked in from outside, "Did the son-in-law go out?" The servant girl nodded and said, "He has been out for a while. It seems that he went to the palace." She was relieved. If he saw that she did not sleep obediently, she would be scolded again. Just as she was about to check on the child, a servant hurried over. "Madam, there is a Miss Sung outside visiting." The servant girl heard this and immediately widened her eyes. Rui was startled. After a moment of absent-mindedness, she immediately said, "Quickly go and invite the girl in." After that, she shook her head again. "Forget it, I will go myself." Chapter 828. Given official Dong's abilities and talents, it is a waste of talent to only be the governor of the capital. Emingzu put down a memorial and stood up. "I have talked to father. We plan to transfer him to the Hall of Governmental Affairs after the new year. According to father, it seems that he wants official Dong to take over Prime Minister Shun's position." The governor of the capital, Dong Wenyun. Li had known him since he was at Qing and Fu. Of course, at that time, he did not know that he was Prime Minister Shun's son-in-law. It sounded normal for a son-in-law to take over his father-in-law's position, but the Shun family still had a high-ranking official in court. Who knew if the brother-in-law and brother-in-law would fight over the position of Prime Minister? Of course, this was the Shun family's business. He did not worry about it. Speaking of this matter, Li looked at her and asked, The position of the capital governor is very important. After official dong is transferred, who do you plan on letting take over? Emingzu casually picked up a memorial from the table and said, "This is the candidate submitted by the Minister of Governmental Affairs. Actually, the most suitable person for this position is the governor of the capital, Lu Dayo. He is suitable to be a parent official, but he can only be a parent official. After reaching the position of capital governor, there is no need to go any higher. Going lower would be a waste of talent," Emingzu said and then shook her head. However, his qualifications are still shallow. If we forcefully promote him, it will inevitably cause criticism. We can only wait until later to consider it. The Cui family, the Qin family, the Han family. Li looked at the memorial and said, "They really know how to pick people. It looks like they are determined to get this position." He had heard Chen Chong mention that the Cui family was determined to get the position of capital governor. Among these nominees, almost all of them were officials in the King of Shu's faction. No matter how they chose, they could not avoid it. Emingzu walked over and said slowly, "Assistant Minister of Revenue, Zheng Shichen. This person is very capable. If we really had to choose from these people, only he can take on this heavy responsibility. Not to mention that she was only a temporary representative of the court. Even a real emperor would have to ask his subordinates to select some important officials before choosing one of them. If they ignored the opinions of the officials and stubbornly acted on their own, the court would be in chaos. Of course, she was different from her father. Her father could make an exception to promote someone, but she did not have the right to do so. Although Zheng Shichen's name was at the end of the list, after some consideration, she still felt that if she had to choose one of these people, Zheng Shichen was the most suitable one. It doesn't make sense to be promoted from the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue to the capital governor. Li shook his head. In order to make up the numbers, the King of Shu's faction was really willing to report anyone and everyone. Zheng Shichen was in the Ministry of Revenue, and he was likely to take over the position of Minister of Revenue in the future. Wasn't that much better than being the capital governor? Although Minister Qin was in the prime Zheng minister's position, it was a lot. Governor's position, Zheng Tseng was of minister. Li Yi continued. Moreover, although Zheng Shichen is capable, he is too lazy. He leaves early every day. How can he be a qualified governor? Old Zheng was different from the Qin and Cui families. This was a muddy water. In order to prevent trouble in the future, it was better to let him be the assistant minister of revenue. Emingzu looked at him in surprise. Do you really have a prejudice against Zheng Shichen? It is just a matter of fact. Li shook his head. Even if Zheng Shichen was here, I would still dare to say this. Your Highness, Assistant Minister Zheng has entered the palace to report. He is waiting outside. A eunuch walked in and bowed. Emingzu looked at Li Yi and said, "Let him in." Zheng Shichen must have just returned to the capital. He had not gone home to change and looked travel-worn. He handed over a memorial with both hands and said, "Your subject has been ordered to supervise the taxation of the Beijing-Hebei region. This is the detailed report. Your Highness, please have a look." When the eunuch took the booklet and handed it over, he raised his head and looked at Li Yi vaguely, then stood still on the spot. Emingzu looked through it carefully and nodded. "Very good. You have worked hard. This is my duty." Zheng Shichen bowed again. "Your Highness, if there is nothing else, I will take my leave." After Zheng Shichen left, Emingzu came over with the list and asked, "Then who do you think should take this position?" Li looked around and thought for a moment. He said, "Let's do as you say." Among these people, Zheng Shichen's status was special. Those on the King of Shu's side would definitely not think that the eldest princess would push the current Assistant Minister of Revenue to the position of capital governor. Thus, he was purely here to fill in the numbers. In this way, their arrangements and plans could be disrupted. It would also be beneficial for their future actions. After all, Lord Sung was a good opponent that could only be found by chance. Thinking of the things that Chen Chong had mentioned, he casually asked, "Oh yes, there's one more thing. Are you familiar with great scholar Chu?" Emingzu suddenly raised her head and looked at him. She said in surprise, "Grand Tutor Chu?" Li shook his head. "What Grand Tutor? I don't know." Chong said he was some Wenxin of the Jing kingdom. Emingzi looked at him nervously and asked, Grand Tutor Chu has just returned to the capital. What's wrong? You met him? Did you have any conflicts? I've only heard of him once. I haven't even met him. How can there be any conflicts? Li looked at her in surprise. Do I look like someone who gets into conflicts so easily? Grand Tutor Chu was once Imperial Father's teacher. Even Prime Minister Qin and Prime Minister Shen have received his teachings. He was once in charge of the Imperial College and the Hongwen Library. All of the nobles in the capital and nearly half of the officials in the court can be considered his students. Grand Tutor Chu is someone that all the scholars in the world look up to. Emingzi looked at him and said seriously, if you meet him, you'd better be respectful. If something really happens, even Imperial Father won't be able to protect you. Don't worry. Why would I provoke him? I'm worried that he'll blackmail me. Li shook his head and waved his hand in farewell. Continue with your work. I'm leaving. Remember, the Chu family is not to be provoked. Emingzi reminded him worriedly. Li waved his hand casually. I know. I won't provoke them for no reason. When he walked out, he was still a little confused and depressed. Why hadn't he heard of this Grand Tutor Chu before? According to Her Royal Highness, this old man had extremely high prestige and influence in both the court and the court. Her Royal Highness might not be able to compare with him. If such a person was recruited by the King of Shu, wouldn't their previous efforts be in vain? When Li Yi walked out of the palace gate, Seng Shichen's figure was still walking slowly in front of him. Hearing the voice behind him, Seng Shichen turned around and cupped his hands. I have to thank County Marquis Li. Li Yi asked in surprise, Why are you thanking me? Seng Shichen looked at him and said, If it weren't for County Marquis Li, I wouldn't have to run around these days. I would have a more relaxed life. You're welcome. It's what I should do. Li Yi waved his hand and said, A pillar of the country like Lord Seng should work hard for the country. Her Royal Highness just said that Lord Seng is outstanding and does a good job. It's reasonable for you to work hard. Seng Shichen raised his eyebrows. County Marquis Li, you must put in a good word for me in front of Her Royal Highness, right? Of course. Li Yi nodded and then waved his hand. It's what I should do. Lord Seng, you don't have to thank me. The two walked side by side. After walking out of the palace gate, Li Yi turned around and asked, Last time in the tea house, I heard Lord Seng talk about the Eastern Palace, but I haven't asked for your opinion yet. Seng Shichen looked at him, his eyes focused, and then he smiled and said, I think that Lord Li is right. This is a matter of the royal family, and it should be decided by His Majesty alone. We the foreign officials should not worry about it. Li Yi nodded, looked at him, and said solemnly, I'm afraid Lord Seng should be prepared to take on more important tasks. Seng Shichen was stunned and a trace of doubt appeared on his face. What do you mean, County Marquis Li? Li Yi waved his hand and turned to leave. You'll know in the future. Chapter 829. Outside the door, the two maids clenched their fists tightly. They looked at each other, and then pressed their ears to the door. Both of them had the urge to rush in if something went wrong. The atmosphere inside the room was much more harmonious. Zheng Zimo looked at the child in the swaddling clothes and smiled. This child really looks like Madame Li. Rui still had a smile on her face. She looked down and said, He looks more like my husband. Zheng Zimo looked down and saw the little fellow in her arms looking around. She said, His eyes are like Madame Li's and his nose is like his. Rui looked at her and suddenly reached out and asked, Would you like to hold him? Zheng Zimo was startled and then said in disbelief, Can I? Of course. Rui handed the swaddling clothes over with a smile. Zheng Zimo carefully took it. The little fellow stared at her, and then raised his hand with difficulty to touch the butterfly embroidered on her chest. Rui said with some surprise, This child is usually shy with strangers. When he was hugged by strangers, he would cry incessantly. It is strange today. He is not shy at all when he sees you. Zheng Zimo played with the little fellow's fingers with a smile and said, Maybe I'm more popular with children. When I was in the Jade Courtyard, one of my sisters gave birth without telling her mother. She cried when everyone held her only. She only finished half of her sentence and her voice gradually faded. At the same time, she lowered her head and carefully handed over the swaddling clothes. When she raised her head, a smile returned to her face. Okay, it is getting late. It is time for us to go back. Rui stood up and said, I will see you out. No need, no need. Zheng Zimo waved her hand and said, I will go out by myself. Madam, rest. Xiao Huan, come and look after Duaner. I will go out for a while. Rui said to the door. Then she looked at Zheng Zimo and smiled. My body has been fine for a long time. Let's go. Son-in-law left in such a hurry this time. With his hands behind his back, Fong strolled to the entrance of the mansion. When he saw a familiar figure, he waved his hand out of habit. What a coincidence, Miss Zheng. Come out, son-in-law is inside. After he said that, he was stunned for a moment. He raised his head and saw the words Li Residence. His eyes widened. When he looked over again, he realized that there was more than one familiar figure. Miss Zheng, eldest miss. Just as he opened his mouth, he slapped himself on the mouth and hurriedly corrected himself. Eldest Miss Zheng, what a coincidence, both of you are going out. Rui looked at him and said in surprise, Uncle Fong. Today's sun. Fong raised his head and looked at the winter sky that was filled with gray clouds. He muttered, how did it disappear? Su. When Li lifted the curtain for the third time, he saw that the sloppy old man still had his eyes closed. He asked worriedly, Can you drive the carriage like this? The sloppy old man said lightly, Don't worry. I don't need my eyes, but I can still see more clearly than others. Li was still a little worried, so he simply lifted the curtain and sat outside. He looked at him and said in surprise, If I remember correctly, Su wasn't like this before. Senior Lu taught me. Li found that after returning from the Qi Kingdom, the sloppy old man became more and more of a man of few words. He quickly understood that Senior Lu was talking about his second granduncle. He didn't understand his words and asked, What's the use of closing your eyes? If the eyes can't see, the heart can see more clearly. The sloppy old man still had his eyes closed. He said, Your realm is too low, so it's normal that you don't understand. Li thought about it and asked, I wonder if Su has heard of the name Xie Sun? The sloppy old man's eyes suddenly opened and he asked, You know Xie Sun too? Ahem, I know a little. Li roughly knew what had happened and said with a dry cough. The sloppy old man nodded and said, That's right. Although Xie Sun is a martial arts senior from 100 years ago, Senior Lu might have mentioned him to you before. Li nodded and asked, Does Su know how the golden-haired Lion King Xie Sun became blind? I don't know. Senior Lu didn't say. Do you know? Li nodded again. Of course, but it's a long story. The sloppy old man sat up straight and waved his hand. There's no rush. Tell me slowly. The story of the Lion King Xie Sun had only just begun when they arrived at the doorstep. The sloppy old man was a little disappointed. Li could only agree to tell him the next time they went out. He jumped off the carriage and watched as another carriage disappeared around the corner in the other direction. He shook his head in confusion and stepped into the mansion. In the room, Rui had just coaxed the child to sleep when Li walked in. After taking a look, he asked suspiciously, What's wrong with Xiao Huan? She's stuttering as if she has something to say. She won't say a word when I ask her. Is it because you didn't rest at noon and you don't want Xiao Huan to tell the truth? Of course not. I slept for a long time at noon. Rui helped the little fellow tuck in the corner of his back before whispering. Li looked at her and said, Don't lie to me, my wife. If Xiao Huan doesn't tell me, I can ask someone else. Why would I lie to you? Rui shook her head and then a smile appeared on her face. She said, You weren't here just now. Duaner called me mother. You lost the bet this morning. What? Li stared at her with wide eyes. A 1-month-old child couldn't even make simple syllables except crying loudly. How could he say mother? Li shook his head and said, Your husband has read a lot of books. Duaner will need at least a few months to say mother. You can't lie to me. Rui looked up at him and said seriously, So you don't believe me? Li opened his mouth to say a word and found that it was a single-choice question. For such a young child, unless he was a monster, it was naturally impossible for him to produce such a difficult syllable. Li could still tell if his child was a monster or not. But could he doubt Rui's words? Obviously not. However, the truth was the truth. It couldn't be shifted or changed by anyone's will. The truth might be late, but it would never be absent. This was what he taught Lui. On one side was the truth, and on the other side was Rui. This was a multiple-choice question. It couldn't be simpler. Li nodded and said with some regret, "In that case, I really lost." He sighed in his heart. Sisters were sisters after all. It turned out that Mississippi Lou was not the only one who knew this trick. Rui smiled and said, "Then do you remember that I can make a request of you? Of course, your husband is a man of his word. Even if you want the stars in the sky, I will ask Fong to take them down." Rui almost never asked him for anything. Naturally, he wouldn't refuse her request. Fong probably wouldn't refuse it either. Then, Rui stood up and held his hand. She looked into his eyes and said seriously, "Husband, let Miss Sing marry us." Chapter 830. Li had to admit that after Rui said this, his heart skipped a beat. More than a beat. "I said, let Sister Zeng marry into our family." Rui looked at him and repeated. Li suddenly didn't know where to put his hands. It didn't seem right to put them outside. It didn't seem right to put them in his sleeves. It didn't seem right either. Put them in his pockets. There were no pockets. Rui took his hand and sat down by the bed. She said, "Sister Zeng came just now." Only then did Li remember the carriage he saw at the gate of the mansion just now. His heart tightened again, and he asked casually, "What did you talk about?" "Just chatting casually. She came to see me and Dwayner, and she even brought the little shoes she made herself. Miss Zeng's needlework is better than mine. Dwayner also likes her very much." Rui smiled and looked at Li. "Sister Zeng is really good. I can see that she likes husband as much as I do." Li looked at her. This kind of joke others might make, but Rui would never make it, let alone a second time. "Wife." Li opened his mouth, but was interrupted by her. Rui held his hand with a smile on her face. She asked, "Does husband like Sister Zeng?" "Yes." Li nodded. This was the only answer he could make at this moment. "I'm sorry, Sister Zeng." Rui looked at him, suddenly lowered her head and said, "I once went to find her without telling husband." Li looked at her in a daze. Neither Rui nor Zuemo had mentioned this to him. Rui said in a low voice, "I asked her if she liked husband. If she liked him, she might as well marry into the Li family." "When?" "Just a few days before husband left the capital." What did she say?" "She refused." Li clenched his other fist. It wasn't hard to imagine the situation and state of mind they were in at that time. No wonder she had been avoiding him for those days. And for Rui to personally go to Willow Lane and say these words to her. What kind of determination did she have? Rui held his hand tightly and said in a low voice, "Husband, I'm sorry. At that time, I only thought that if she could marry into the Li family, she might be able to give birth to a child for you and the Li family. I was too selfish." Li let out a sigh of relief, shook his head and said, "I'm the one who should say sorry." "Don't say that, husband." Rui leaned on his shoulder and said, "My husband is very good to me. I know that my husband cares about my feelings, so I can only let Miss Zeng suffer." Li put his arm around her waist and lowered his head to ask, "Now that we have Dwayner, why do you still let?" "Because little Sister Zeng is really good." Rui lowered her head and murmured, "Not to mention husband, even I am starting to like her." She suddenly raised her head and asked curiously, "How did husband and Miss Zeng first meet?" "How did they meet?" Li thought for a moment and said, "I think I just came here. Not long after I was caught by Rui and brought to the village. One time, I went down the mountain and was brought to the jadeite courtyard by Li Xian. You know how Li Xian is. He's a playboy by nature, and always goes to these brothels. I didn't want to go, but he dragged me. That day at the jadeite courtyard, I happened to see her performing. I mistook her for someone else, and thought she was an old acquaintance. I lost my composure and interrupted her performance and was called a lecher." "Old acquaintance?" Rui looked up at him and asked, An old acquaintance who could make you lose your composure must be very important to you. Where is she now? How is she doing? Li Yi was a little absent-minded and then said, It's been a long time. Now that I think about it, it seems like it happened in my previous life. As for her, I will never see her again. It was a misunderstanding, and at this time, he could only explain it to Rui in this way. Rui lowered her head and said, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have mentioned it. It's okay. Li Yi helped her smooth the hair in front of her forehead and continued, Speaking of it, it's not the first time. The first time was when I took her painting by mistake. The painting that husband hid in the study? Yes, that's the one. Li Yi was stunned and then continued. Later on, at the jadeite courtyard, of course, I was brought there by Li Xian and accidentally broke into her room. At that time, she had just come out of the shower, and then, if there's such a thing, then husband. It was a misunderstanding. That was a pure misunderstanding. Li Yi shook his head repeatedly. Later on, I accidentally saw her changing clothes. I didn't see anything that time. It was also a misunderstanding. Did you see anything that time? No, that day. Later, we moved to the capital. When we left, I wrote a few poems for her to compete for the title of courtesan belle, but I didn't know that she had long wanted to redeem herself. Once she became the courtesan belle, her value would increase greatly. She couldn't redeem herself and almost made things worse. There were more than a dozen of them. More than a dozen? Maybe I remembered it wrong. Later on, she came to the capital and helped in the brothel, and then helped in the clothing store. For a period of time, some people in the capital targeted me, which affected her a lot. She was almost wronged and imprisoned. Rui blinked and asked, Then you fell in love with her after a long time? No. Li shook his head and said, It hasn't reached that stage yet. Then, has it reached that stage yet? Except for those few accidents, they actually didn't even hold hands. Li shook his head and frankly told the truth. Husband, you can make the decision on this matter. Rui lowered her head and held his hand tightly. She bit her lower lip and said slowly, That's all I can do. Li didn't say anything. He just held her tightly with his other arm. After that, there was no sound coming from the room. When the little fellow woke up, Rui went to coax her. He played with her for a while. When he stepped out of the room, he heard the voice behind him again. Husband, I have a question. Rui's voice was soft. If I and Sister Zeng fell into the water at the same time, who would you save first? Bang. When Li stepped out of the door, he tripped heavily and flew straight down the corridor. Fortunately, he reacted quickly and only fell awkwardly when he landed. He was not as miserable as Chen Zhongzhong. Fong stood in the courtyard and looked at this scene in a daze. Then he walked over and sighed, saying, Young master, think about it. There are no obstacles in life that can't be overcome. Li tidied up his clothes and looked at him in surprise. He asked, What are you talking about? Fong patted him on the shoulder, sighed again and said, Eldest miss will beat and scold you. Just bear with it and it will be over. Don't fight back, or you will be beaten even worse. Li frowned and looked at him. What are you trying to say? Fong had a puzzled expression on his face and asked, You've been inside for so long. Didn't eldest miss say anything? She did. Li looked at him and said, Rui asked me to marry Zimo. Strange. Looking at Fong, who was suddenly stunned, Li shook his head and turned to leave. Marry her. Old Fong turned around and stared blankly at the disappearing figure before he shook his head in disbelief. There's no justice. Chapter 831. Li, you've come. When Li walked into the small courtyard in Willow Lane, Xiao Chui lowered her head and spoke. She looked listless. Li looked at her and asked in confusion, What's wrong? Are you not feeling well? I'm fine. Xiao Chui looked at him and opened her mouth. In the end, she still shook her head mechanically. Li looked at her and asked, Do you have something to say to me? Miss doesn't allow me to say it. Xiao Chui lowered her head and said, then quickly ran away. Li stood where he was and shook his head. He roughly knew what she wanted to say. Crossing the courtyard, he saw that the door to the art studio was open and walked in. That familiar figure was painting inside. More accurately, she was designing clothes. These things had originally been done by a few people, but in a certain aspect, she was actually quite similar to Wan Ruoqing. They were the kind of people who could not stay idle. There was a stove in the room, but if one's hand was left outside for a long time, it would still be a little cold. When Li Yi walked in, she put down her brush and put her 2 hands by her mouth to breathe. When she saw Li Yi walk in, a trace of panic appeared on her face. Li Yi walked over and wrapped her hands in his. He said, "It's such a cold day. Don't paint anymore. If your hands get frozen, it won't be easy in the future." Being held by him like this, it was very warm and also very comforting. She struggled a few times but could not break free, so she did not resist anymore. She lowered her head and said in a small voice, "I went to your house today. I didn't tell you in advance. I'm sorry. I just thought I should go and see. I didn't think." "I know." Li Yi nodded and said, "Rui told me everything." She raised her head slightly and said, I didn't want to cause you any trouble." "I know." Li Yi nodded and asked, "At that time before I went to the Qi Kingdom, did Rui come to look for you?" Zheng Zimo's body trembled imperceptibly. She then nodded and said, "She came here once. She's your wife and asked about the shop. Mrs. Li is very nice." "That's all?" She nodded and said, "That's all. She told me that too." Li Yi let go of her hand, took a deep breath, held her in his arms and whispered, "I'm sorry, that sentence should have been said by me." The delicate body in his arms trembled. Her eyes were filled with tears, but her face was full of smiles. "It's nothing, don't blame her. Anyway, I didn't take it seriously. It's nothing, really nothing. Last time doesn't count." Li Yi let go of her, held her shoulders and looked into her eyes. She hurriedly wiped her face and lowered her head. "Now I'll ask again." Li Yi looked at her and asked, "Are you willing to marry into the Li family?" Although her heart was beating wildly, she still raised her head, sniffed and said, "No." "If you don't want to, then I'll ask again." Li Yi held her face and asked again, "Miss Zeng, are you willing to marry into the Li family?" "No." "Luo Shui goddess, are you willing to marry into the Li family?" "No." "Nan Nan, are you willing to marry into the Li family?" "Yes." Xiao Chui stood at the door, clenched her fists and said anxiously, "Miss, say you are willing." Xiao Chui was slapped on the butt and left. Zheng Zimo sat on the bed, shook her head, and said, "I'm fine here. Why would I go to the Li family? Do you want to raise me like a canary? Besides, if I leave, what about Sister Ruoqing? If we leave, she and Xiaozhu will be the only ones left here." In fact, Li Yi had already thought about this problem before he came. This matter still depended on her choice. For now, this method should be the most suitable. One step at a time. She had already experienced too many setbacks and tribulations to reach this step. She must not be impatient. Xiao Chui poked her head out from the door and said, "Li, miss, I know how to solve this matter." Li glanced over there and said, "Xiao Chui, close the door. Don't eavesdrop." The little maid pursed her lips and closed the door in a sullen mood. Zheng Zimo looked at him and suddenly said, "In 2 days, I want you to accompany me to the Zheng family." Li Yi frowned. "Why are we going to the Zheng family?" "Never mind." Zheng Zimo shook her head again and said, "Let's wait for a few days." "No need to wait. We'll go in 2 days." Li Yi shook his head and said, "Since it is Nanan's matter, even if it is a mountain of swords and a sea of flames, I have to go. Even if the Zheng family is a dragon's den, I have to go." "Don't be serious." Zheng Zimo rolled her eyes at him and said, "What mountain of swords and sea of flames? I just want to take over my parents' memorial tablets. Last time, I went with Sister Ruoqing." She stopped abruptly at this point. Li Yi frowned and asked, "You two went before. Didn't the Zheng family give it to you?" Zheng Zimo nodded and said, "That was at the beginning of the year." Li Yi patted her hand and said, "Don't worry, Master Zheng is a sensible person. He will give it to you." "Not because of him." Zheng Zimo shook her head and said, "Let's talk about this in a few days." Li Yi nodded and thought of something. He suddenly asked, "Let me ask you a question. If Master Zheng and I fell into the water at the same time, and you could only save one, who would you save?" Zheng Zimo shook her head and said, I don't know how to swim, so, she thought for a moment and seemed to have thought of something. She looked at Li Yi and asked, if it was me and Madame Li who fell into the water, who would you save? Li Yi's expression froze. Don't talk too much, don't talk too much. The more you talk, the more mistakes you make. This was an unchanging truth. Seeing the eyes of the Luo Shui goddess, Li Yi thought for a moment and said, don't worry, Rui will save you. Her martial arts are very high and she can fly by stepping on water. She said this morning that she likes you, so she won't leave you in the lurch. In the carriage, old Fong couldn't help but ask, son-in-law, was what you said this morning true? Old Fong couldn't help but feel puzzled. Li Yi glanced at him and asked, what is it? Do you have any thoughts? No. Fong shook his head and said, what thoughts can I have? They didn't speak along the way. When Fong returned home and sat at the table, he saw his wife coming out of the kitchen with a tray. He shook his head and sighed. I already said that our family doesn't lack money. We can just hire a few maids to do the cooking and cleaning. The reason for hiring maids wasn't just to clean. They had been eating plain food for decades, even if they had to change it every 2 days. So what if you have money? You can do whatever you want just because you have money. You might have forgotten the hard times you had in the past, but I haven't. You even hired maids. Mrs. Fong reprimanded him a few times. Then, as if she had thought of something, her brows immediately furrowed. Hired maids? You even hired a few? Tell me, did you have some devious thoughts again? Okay, no more. Seeing that his wife was about to lose her temper again, Fong quickly changed the topic and asked, what do you want to eat today? Fong's wife glared at him and said, wild vegetable porridge. Fong's face immediately turned bitter. Wild vegetable porridge again. What's wrong with wild vegetable porridge? I specially went outside the city to pick these wild vegetables to let you know that the hard days before have only passed a few years ago. But didn't I just eat it the day before yesterday? Fong's face was bitter. He said, I've eaten it all my life. Can't I change it to something else? For example, the white fungus and lotus seed porridge I had a few days ago. That's the leftover wild vegetables from the day before yesterday. Wait. If you don't want to eat it after eating it all your life, then I've been with you all my life. Are you tired of it? Fong's wife put down the bowl and chopsticks, picked up a broom and pointed at him. Tell me, who made the white fungus and lotus seed porridge for you? Do you have someone outside? Well, I've long heard that when you were outside, you always went to the Jade Courtyard. Do you have someone outside? Fong's face turned red. He pointed at her and stammered. You're slandering me. I'm slandering you. Tell me, who made the white fungus and lotus seed porridge for you? Can't you learn more from Miss Fong? Well, you've grown up. You even mentioned Miss Fong. If you don't tell me the truth today, you won't be able to live on. After a while, the man who ran out of the house alone stood on the street, rubbed his butt that was hit by the broom, sighed deeply and said to the sky, there's no justice. Chapter 832. As the end of the year approached, the festive atmosphere in the capital grew stronger. In the Li Manor, the festive atmosphere had not dissipated since the birth of the young master. Today, the manor was especially lively. Li Xian's heir's wife brought the little princess to visit. Rui did not have many friends in Jingdo, so the heir's wife was one of the few people she could talk to. Furthermore, she was pregnant at the same time, and the two children were born only a few hours apart. Imperceptibly, there was an additional layer of intimacy between them. The two of them were talking in the room. The two children were hugged by their respective mothers. They looked at each other and stared at each other. In another hall, Li Xian was not convinced and said, why not? You have to give me a reason, right? I said no means no. You don't have to experiment. This method won't work. Just give up. Li Yi waved his hand and said without hesitation. On the road of science, he was still standing at the crossroads. He wanted to use two pools, one high and one low, to create a device that would never stop moving and solve the problem of getting water in arid areas. Even if he became the emperor and could change the laws of the Jing kingdom, he could not change the law of conservation of energy, not to mention that he was only a small crown prince. Li Xian said firmly. I still think this method is feasible. Brother Shun and I have the same idea. Just wait and see. You'll know when the time comes. Li shook his head and said, there's no need to go through so much trouble. You might as well find a donkey and hang a handful of fresh grass next to its mouth. It won't be able to eat it no matter what. This way, it will keep walking forward. You can put that thing on the donkey and let it run in circles. That way, it can pump water from a low place to a high place. Li Xian's face showed a thoughtful expression. His eyes grew brighter and brighter. At a certain moment, he suddenly slapped his thigh and said, why didn't I think of this method? Li Yi waved his hand and said, all right, you can go find your brother Shen and think about it. I have something to say to Emingzu. Li Xian shook his head, sat down and said, it's quite cold outside. You guys talk. I'll stay here and think. I won't disturb you. Li looked at him without saying a word. Li Xian looked at him and finally thought of something. He stood up and nodded. I understand. It's not safe here. Tell me, I'll go out and keep a lookout for you. Therefore, it was very reliable to have such a friend. At critical times, he could betray them and keep a lookout. With such a friend, what more could he ask for? Li sat down at the table and poured a cup of tea for the two of them. He asked, are you sure you want Seng Shichen to take over after Lord Dong is transferred? Li Mingzhu nodded and said, I'm confident in his ability to handle matters, but Li knew what she was worried about. When it came to choosing officials, ability was important, but political stance was even more important. A person who was not outstanding but had a firm stance was definitely more worthy of consideration than a person who was outstanding but had a wrong political stance. Li shook his head and said, don't worry about this. Lord Sung is a smart man. He knows what choice to make. He had already tested Seng Shichen several times. For such a person, some things didn't need to be said clearly. A look or a casual word could reach some kind of tacit understanding. Taking 10,000 steps back, since Seng Shichen could help him sit in this position, he could also ask him to step down. As for the specifics, he would have to wait and see. Oh yes, the Spring Festival is approaching. The Grand Court Conference is coming soon. In another half a month, it will be the Lantern Festival again. A few days ago, the Cui family united with the officials to petition for the King of Shu to be transferred back. What did His Majesty say? Thinking of another matter, Li turned to look at her and asked. Falsification, creating momentum among the people, inciting public opinion. Emingzi shook her head and said, what he did was no different from rebellion. How could father forgive him so easily? He had already ordered the two prime ministers that if they encountered such a petition again, they would directly strike it down. All of His Majesty's children are smarter than the other. How could the King of Shu? A trace of doubt appeared on Li Yi's face. He asked with some surprise, do you think there is a possibility, Emingzu covered his mouth and said with a frown, is this something we can talk about? Li Yi moved her hand away and said innocently, I just want to ask if the King of Shu had a fever when he was young and damaged his brain. Speaking of the King of Shu. A trace of doubt appeared on Mingzhu's face. Even though he is usually a little reckless, it is impossible for him to be so reckless and choose such an opportunity. She looked at Li Yi with a burning gaze and asked, tell me honestly, was it you? We are familiar with each other, but if you talk nonsense like this, I can't do anything to you. He looked at her with a serious expression and said, your status is different now. You must remember to be careful with your words and actions. After reminding her, he stood up and walked out the door. Where are you going? You only have 1 day off. Rest well. I am going to talk to Li Xian about the donkey. The court had always been sensitive. Even the slightest movement would be magnified countless times. Not to mention that the capital governor, Dong Wenyun, was about to be transferred to the secretariat to take up an important position. The position of the capital governor might be taken over by the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue, Seng Shichen. Although it was said to be taking over, it was actually not just taking over, because there was no news from the court about who would take over the position of the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue. This meant that Seng Shichen was not only the capital governor, but also the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue. The meaning of this was completely different. The Chui family. The head of the Chui family had a face full of doubt. He paced in the hall and murmured, "How could it be Lord Sung?" This time, they had indeed used a lot of power, and even paid a lot of price to determine the list of candidates for the position of the capital governor. It was to ensure that this position did not fall into the hands of others. However, among them, there were not many who were qualified to take over this position. Helpless, they let Sing Shichen take up the position. It was better than giving up the position to someone else, and risking the risk of losing it to someone else. But no one expected that Sing Shichen actually went up. Although they did not lose anything and allowed their own people to take the position as they wished, this was completely different from the plan. Even some of the follow-up arrangements were affected. A man stepped forward and said, "Big brother, why worry? What difference does it make whether it is Lord Sung or Lord Qin who goes up? Even if it is different from what we expected, it is still a good thing, isn't it?" That being said, I can't figure out the eldest princess's thoughts at all. Which of the others is not more suitable than Lord Sung? After saying this, he shook his head and said, "You are right. No matter what, this is a good thing for us. Go and personally send the invitation. Tomorrow night, we will hold a banquet at the Drunken Moon Tower to congratulate Lord Sung." The middle-aged man nodded and said, "Okay, I will go to the Zung residence right away." Today, she had an appointment with Zumo to go to the Zung residence to retrieve her parents' memorial tablets. Along the way, the closer she was to the Zung residence, the slower her steps became. When she was about to reach the gate of the Zung residence, she finally stopped and could not take another step. Li Yi turned around and found that she was staring at the gate of the Zung residence with a very complicated look in her eyes. "Don't worry, I am here." Li Yi held her hand and squeezed slightly, then strode in the direction of the gate. Chapter 833. Gentlemen, do you have a name card for me to hand in? The gatekeeper of the Zung residence was very polite. He didn't look like he was going to let them in or announce their arrival. Today there was a joyous occasion in the residence, and many important people had come. They couldn't just go and inform everyone that came. Only a good gatekeeper who could help the master choose when to meet and who not to meet, and when to meet was a good gatekeeper. The last gatekeeper had let someone in who shouldn't have been, and that was why he was kicked out by the madam. Li Yi held Zeng Zimo's hand and said calmly, "You just have to go in and tell Master Zeng that an old friend from Willow Alley is here to visit." He already knew about the changes that had happened to the Zeng family over the past decade, but he was still not very clear about the inside story. Zimo didn't want to admit that she was a member of the Zeng family, and didn't want to call Tseng Shichen, second uncle. She must have her reasons, so he naturally had to let her be. The gatekeeper smiled and said, "Gentlemen, I'm really sorry, but my master is busy today. Why don't you come another day?" No name card meant that they weren't important people. The two were so young, and they didn't even say who they were. They only said they were old friends. Old friends. It was obvious that they had heard that their master had been promoted and wanted to use connections. If it was any other day, he would still go in to inform them just in case. But today was different. If he dampened the mood of the guests, he couldn't afford to be responsible as a lowly gatekeeper. Li Yi didn't come today to reason with the Zeng family, and there was no reason to. The Zeng family wouldn't give him what he wanted, and he had to get it. Under such circumstances, he had to rely on other means to solve the problem. Li Yi looked at the sloppy old man standing not far behind the two. The sloppy old man covered one side of his face and walked over with a slightly gloomy expression. His gloomy expression wasn't because he was being ordered around by Li Yi, but because one of his teeth was broken and half of his face was swollen. Naturally, it caused some emotional fluctuations. "Is Miss back?" The sloppy old man didn't walk over, but an old voice suddenly came from inside the door. The voice was trembling and excited. When the gatekeeper saw him, he immediately bowed and said respectfully, "Housekeeper Ho." The old man called Steward Ho ignored him and quickly walked over. He looked at Sung Zimo excitedly and said with a trembling voice, 13 years and 9 months. "Miss you, you're finally back." Zhang Zimo looked at him and sighed after a long time. Uncle Ho, congratulations on your promotion, Lord Sung. With Lord Sing's ability, your future career will definitely be smoother. This official will first propose a toast to Lord Zhang. What are you talking about, Lord Lu? These are all groundless rumors. Sung Shichen clinked glasses with an official he was familiar with, and another voice came from the other side. This is not groundless speculation. Lord Zhang's appointment letter has already been seen by someone. I reckon that the court will begin after the Lantern Festival at the latest. The earliest it will be announced will be during the Grand Court Conference. Come, let me also propose a toast to Lord Zhang. After Sung Shichen clinked glasses again, his body began to sway. Today, with these people coming to the residence, he had already drunk quite a bit. Normally, his tolerance for alcohol was only average, but at this moment, he was almost at his limit. A woman dressed in luxurious clothing walked in from outside the door and held his arm. She turned her head and said apologetically, "Sirs, I am truly sorry. Lord Chui is hosting a banquet at Drunken Moon Pavilion tonight. Lord Qin and Lord Chen will also be there. At that time, there will be some matters to discuss. My master really cannot drink anymore. Since this is the case, let's quickly let Lord Sung rest. If something important is ruined, we cannot afford to bear the consequences." Yes, let's quickly let Lord Sung rest. These people also knew what the surnames Chui, Qin and Chen represented, so they did not stop her. This woman will not disturb the sirs. The woman looked at the two servant girls beside her and said, "Hurry and help the master to rest." Yes. As soon as the woman walked out of the hall, a figure hurried over and whispered something in her ear. Hearing this, the woman's brows instantly furrowed. Didn't she already deny being a member of the Zhang family? Why is she causing trouble at this time? A trace of disgust appeared on her face as she said, "The master is already resting. Let's leave her for a while first. When the time comes, find a random reason to send her away." The servant immediately bowed and said yes. Just a jinx. Does she really think she is still the young mistress of the Zhang family? The woman murmured and left with a sullen expression. Ever since I can remember, Uncle Ho has been taking care of all the chores in the family. Uncle Ho treated me very well back then. While the two were waiting in a side hall, Zhang Zimo looked at the old man standing at the door and whispered. The old man looked around and finally walked in with a smile on his face. He looked at Li Yi and asked, "Miss, this gentleman is?" "I am her husband." Li Yi held her hand and looked at the old man with a smile. "Zimo is indebted to Uncle Ho for taking care of me when I was young." Zhang Zimo blushed but didn't resist. She held his hand even tighter. The old man was startled when he heard this. He looked him up and down a few times before a smile appeared on his old face again. He said, "So it's the son-in-law. You're really a talented man." When I was young, I hid things inside and father and mother did not know. She really did take down the brick in the corner. Actually, it was only half a brick, so there was a small space inside. She took out a yellowed paper bag from inside. The paper bag was torn apart, and there was some black residue inside. The word Suji Worldwide Commerce could be faintly seen on the paper bag. She stood up, clapped her hands, and murmured, "This place is exactly the same as before." Li held her hand and asked, "Do you like it here?" She nodded slightly and said softly, "Coming here, I remembered many things from the past." "As long as you like it." Li nodded, looked around and murmured, "As long as you like it." Chapter 834. When the two walked out of the yard, Zhang Zimo looked around again and asked the old man, "Uncle Ho, the garden in the back?" The old man nodded and said, it's there, it's exactly the same as before." She held on to Li Yi's hand, a look of reminiscence on her face. "That garden is where we used to play hide and seek when we were young. I know a place where once hidden, no one can find it no matter how hard they try." As they walked in the direction of the garden, she said with some regret, "Unfortunately, it's winter now. If we wait until summer, when the leaves are the densest, it would be the best place to play hide and seek." Li shook his head and said, "It's okay, then we'll play in summer." Besides, it's our home, so we can play whenever we want. She shook her head and said. That was before. Li looked around and murmured. It will be the same in the future. Congratulations, Zijian. Master Zeng has been promoted to the capital governor, and is also the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue. This is rare even in the previous 2 dynasties. It's my father who was promoted, it has nothing to do with me. Zijian just likes to be humble. That's not right. Master Zeng's career is smooth, and the Zeng family's status in the capital will naturally rise. Zijian, perhaps your matter will also be loosened. In the stone pavilion in the center of the garden, screens were erected on all 4 sides to block out the cold. A large stove was lit in the center of the stone pavilion, and there was a copper pot on top of the stove. Boiling water bubbled in the pot. Several young people around the stove put meat and vegetables into the pot to cook, chatting as they ate. The screens blocked out the cold outside and wrapped in the heat inside, so there was no cold inside at all. Zeng Zijian picked up the wine warmed in the small stove and took a sip. He shook his head and said, It's not easy to overturn an edict personally issued by the current emperor. I don't want to become an official anymore. There's nothing wrong with being a good-for-nothing young master waiting to die. The young man on his left dipped a mouthful of mutton and comforted him. Zijian, don't be discouraged. In at least a year, at most 2 or 3 years, this decree will be nullified. It's not like you don't know His Majesty's health. How long do you think he can hold on? Lord Zeng is now highly promoted, and will definitely be highly regarded by the King of Shu in the future. When that time comes, Zijian's matters will only require a word from His Highness. Zeng Zijian glanced at him and said, Brother Han, be careful with your words. The young man said disapprovingly, This is the Zeng family, your territory. Zijian, you're too cowardly. Is there anyone who can hear us? He shook his head and dipped another mouthful of mutton. Then he smacked his lips and said, It's said that this thing called hot pot was created by that Li Yi. Tell me, as a county marquis and a minister of Jin Ziguanglu, why does he like these crooked ways instead of doing proper work? Just as he finished speaking, a corner of the screen was lifted up to reveal a passage. Li Yi poked half of his body in and said with a frown, I can pretend that I didn't hear what you said earlier about His Majesty not having 2 years to live, but don't you think it's a little too much to say such things while eating hot pot? Li Yi looked at Zeng Zijian and asked, Young Master Zeng, what do you think? Pa. Why are you here? The wine pot in Zeng Zijian's hand fell to the ground and his expression changed drastically. As for that young Master Han, his face turned from white to green, and then to white again. The words, just now you said that His Majesty doesn't have 2 years to live, echoed in his mind. He suddenly stood up from his seat. If these words were to reach His Majesty's ears, no matter what position the Han family held in the imperial court, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to exterminate them. Clang. Because he stood up too abruptly, his thigh bumped into the stove. The copper pot on the stove shook violently before it toppled over. The boiling hot soup splashed everywhere. Then, there were a few ear-piercing screams of terror. The screens on the 4 sides were knocked down by the people and fell to the ground. When the copper pot rolled down, Li Yi simply turned around and grabbed Miss Zeng by the waist. With a light leap, he landed under the pavilion. With a soft body in his arms, Li Yi looked at the people who ran out of the pavilion with ferocious expressions and took off their shoes and jumped on the spot. He sighed and said, Although hot pot is delicious, the water is so hot. You have to be careful when eating it. The screams quickly attracted the guards of the Zeng residence. A middle-aged woman hurried over from behind. After seeing Zeng Zijian's pained expression, her expression changed and she hurriedly said, Zijian, what's wrong? What happened? Zeng Zijian clenched his teeth and looked at Li Yi with frightened eyes. He shook his head and said, No, it's nothing. I just accidentally knocked over the soup pot. Mother, don't worry. Stay here and don't move. The woman said to him, then turned around and said to the guard sternly, Why are you still standing here? Quick, go get the doctor. In addition to Zeng Zijian, 3 other people were drenched by the boiling water. However, it was only a slight burn and some flesh pain. Apart from being temporarily unable to move, they were fine. Seeing that Zeng Zijian was fine, the middle-aged woman stood up and glanced in a certain direction. She strode over and looked at Zheng Zimo with a frown. What are you doing here? Zheng Zimo grasped Li Yi's hand and walked out. She looked at the middle-aged woman and said calmly, I'm here to take back my parents' spirit tablet. Spirit tablet? The middle-aged woman pouted. Your parents are sinners of the Zheng family. They brought shame to the ancestors of the Zheng family, and let their spirit tablet occupy a corner of the ancestral hall. What are you dissatisfied with? Li Yi felt her grip on his hand was a bit tight, so he gently patted the back of her hand. My father was framed by someone, Yi Zichen said. Zheng Zimo looked at her and said word by word. You have already expelled him from the Zheng family. He is no longer a member of the Zheng family. Now, I am going to take back their spirit tablet. The middle-aged woman sneered. I wonder if your dead parents would want their spirit tablet to be placed in the ancestral hall of the Zheng family, or in the hands of a dirty prostitute. Li Yi suddenly felt a stinging pain on the back of his hand. It was because her nails had sunk into the flesh of his hand. It's okay, I will take care of it. He stepped forward, shielding her behind him. He turned around and whispered. The middle-aged woman was startled and frowned. What are you? Zheng Shichen is quite smart. Why did he marry a thing like you? Li Yi looked at the middle-aged woman and shook his head. You slap. As soon as the middle-aged woman opened her mouth, a loud sound was heard, followed by a burning pain on one side of her face. This slap is for what you said just now. Slap. As the middle-aged woman froze in place, her face full of disbelief, Li Yi flipped his hand again. This slap is because you scolded me earlier. Let me correct you. I am Li Yi not. Li Yi stopped in time. After thinking about it, he looked at her with dissatisfaction. You still want to play tricks with me? Slap. Another crisp slap rang out. This slap is a trick. Chapter 835. In fact, Li Yi himself did not like to slap faces. The effect of force was mutual, equal in magnitude and opposite in direction, acting on the same straight line. From a physical point of view, this was an act of hurting the enemy 1,000 times while hurting oneself 1,000 times. He disliked hitting women even more. Hitting women was a sign of a man's incompetence. However, for some people who were extremely hateful, so hateful that people ignored their gender, a loss was a loss. He had to be happy and clear his mind. In fact, he wanted to lose a few thousand more, but he was held back by drunken Mo. She looked up at Li Yi and shook her head slightly. Li Yi nodded and said, Don't worry, we are here to reason things out today. Li. Sung Zijin looked at him fiercely, and a beast-like growl came from his throat. Li Yi raised his hand and pressed down, saying, Don't move, you are still injured. He had only used ordinary strength when he slapped the middle-aged woman just now. Otherwise her face would not have been so simply swollen. But even so, it was enough for her to freeze on the spot, and not come back to her senses for a long time. You dare to hit me? When the blankness in her eyes became clear, the middle-aged woman looked at him in disbelief, and said in a trembling voice, This was the Zheng family, and she was the mistress of the Zheng family. How could she be slapped 3 times by an outsider in front of so many people? Li Yi said politely, Each of these 3 slaps is reasonable. If Madam feels that you are still unclear about which slap and feel wronged, I can explain it to you again. The middle-aged woman stretched out her hand and pointed at him tremblingly. She said to the remaining 2 guards, Catch him, catch him. Just as the 2 guards were about to move, a burst of noisy footsteps came from behind. Songer, what's wrong with you? Why is your face so pale? Mingda, what's wrong with your foot? Go Sheng, you guys. A few men hurried over from behind. When they saw the young men wailing in pain, or with twisted expressions, their expressions immediately changed, and they asked with concern. This was especially so for a middle-aged man with the surname Han. When he saw his son's pale face, trembling body, and the obvious smell of urine coming from his lower body, he could not suppress the anger on his face. He stood up abruptly and said angrily, Who did this? Who did this? Lord Han, you seem to be very free today. Li Yi smiled at the middle-aged man who had lost his composure. His smile was very kind, but in the eyes of Lord Han, it was no less than a demon. For some people in the capital, this was the smile of the devil. A smile from a demon could destroy a family if it was light, and exterminate an entire clan if it was heavy. Lordly. Lord Han's legs turned to jelly, and he sat back down. The other two, who were just about to stick their bodies out, shrank back and turned their heads to look around, pretending to be enjoying the scenery in the garden. Li Yi had some impression of this Lord Han. He was the Minister of Revenue, and was considered the second or third most important person in the Han family of the capital. He was not familiar with the other two. He looked at them and asked, "These two lords are?" The two of them knew that they couldn't hide anymore, so they immediately bowed. "I am Feng Kuan, the Minister of Revenue." "Greetings, Lord Li." "I am Wei Jin, the Minister of Granaries." "Greetings, Lord Li." "No need to stand on ceremony, no need to stand on ceremony." Li Yi smiled and waved his hand. He asked, "How was the banquet at the Zeng residence? Was it passable?" The three couldn't figure out what this Lord Li meant. Lord Han immediately nodded and said, It was all right. It seems that Lord Zeng's hospitality is not bad." Li Yi nodded his head and asked, "Since you've eaten and drank, why don't you tell me why you're drinking and celebrating here before it's time to close the yamen? Could it be that the Ministry of Revenue's yamen has moved to Assistant Minister Zeng's fu?" This. Hearing this, the three were speechless at the same time, and cold sweat began to drip from their foreheads. Although there was a fixed time for the opening and closing of the yamen, it only needed to be done in the morning. As for when to close the yamen, it depended on the specific number of errands that each person had. This was a tacit practice that everyone agreed on. There were also some officials who did not work in the yamen. Therefore, if their superiors did not care, they could go home early or do some other things. However, this did not mean that they could drink and have fun during the normal court hours. This crime could be serious or minor. If it was a minor one, they would be fined. If it was a serious one, they would be demoted. But who knew that they would be caught by the minister of the imperial court while drinking in the Zeng mansion? Li County Marquis Li. Zeng Shichen walked over quickly with the help of a servant. Hearing that there was trouble in the mansion, he immediately sobered up a little. Seeing the two people standing in the courtyard, he squeezed out a smile on his face. "Zemo, you're here too." Li shook his head. "Lord Zeng is really in a good mood." "Lord." Seeing Zeng Shichen coming, the middle-aged woman immediately burst into tears. Pointing at Li Yi and Zeng Zemo, she said loudly, "This prostitute brought her." "Shut up." Zeng Shichen's face suddenly showed anger. His almost roaring voice scared the woman to the spot. Looking at the woman's swollen cheek, he waved his hand and said, "Come, take the lady back." Then he looked at Li Yi and said, "County Marquis Li, this is not the place to talk. This way, please." He glanced at Zeng Zijian behind him. "You come with me." Seeing those people leave, Lord Han looked at his son who was still sitting on the ground. An inexplicable anger rose in his heart. He kicked him and scolded, "Tell me what happened just now." Father, help." Before the young man finished his words, Lord Han's face turned pale. What? Your Majesty," he shuddered, then fell limply to the ground, his face full of despair. The other two assistant counselors and manager of the Ministry of Revenue were also scared out of their wits. They fiercely grabbed their sons' collars and angrily said, "Speak! Did you say anything you shouldn't have? Speak!" After stepping into the room, Zeng Shichen turned back and bowed. "Zemo, if your aunt said anything she shouldn't have said, I apologize to you here." Zeng Zemo hurriedly dodged and didn't accept the bow. "I don't care what she said. I just want to bring back my parents' memorial tablets today." Zeng Shichen raised his head and revealed a troubled expression. Back then, Big Brother was framed by a scoundrel. In order to protect the Zeng family, your grandmother expelled him from the family. However, he is still a member of the Zeng family. Don't worry, I will clear Big Brother's name and restore his identity. Zeng Zemo closed her eyes and took a deep breath, saying slowly, "No need." 13 years ago, they were no longer members of the Zeng family. 13 years later, they still aren't. I will worship their memorial tablets well, and won't take up space in the Zeng family's ancestral shrine. Zemo. Li shook his head and interrupted him. He looked at him and said slowly, Lord Sung, we didn't come here today to listen to you. Sung Shichen looked at him and said, Lord Li, this is the Zung family's business. I hope you won't interfere. Sorry, I think Lord Sung is mistaken about one thing. Li Yi held her hand and looked at Sung Shichen. This is not the Zung family's business. It's the Li family's business. Chapter 836. You the Li family. Sung Shichen murmured and looked at the two with a new gaze. You have already. Li Yi met his eyes and nodded. Sung Shichen was stunned for a long time before nodding. Okay, that's fine. He looked at Li Yi and said again, My brother and sister-in-law have passed away. It is the best choice for their spirit tablets to be placed in the ancestral shrine. I, Sung Shichen, swear to the heavens that I will clear my brother's grievances in my lifetime, and let their spirit tablets be placed in front of the Zung family's ancestral shrine with dignity. Zung Zumo looked up at him with a hint of emotion in her eyes. Li Yi shook his head and said, Lord Zung is Lord Zung, and the Zung family is the Zung family. I can represent the Zung family. If you could represent the Zung family, we wouldn't be here today. Li Yi waved his hand and asked, So are you going to bring it over, or should we go get it? Sung Shichen shook his head and said, Outsiders are not allowed to enter the ancestral shrine of the Zung family. Let me go get it. Then he glanced at Zung Zijian and said, Zijian, come with me. Li Yi took Zung Zumo's hand and sat down. He asked, Did he say the same thing to you last time? Zung Zumo shook her head and said, Last time he wasn't in the manner because, she didn't continue, but it wasn't hard to imagine what had happened last time, judging from the woman's attitude toward her just now. A trace of hostility rose in Li Yi's heart. He really should have found a few more reasons and slapped her a few more times. Suddenly, he caught a glimpse of a head peeking at the door. He frowned and said coldly, Who is sneaking around there? Misunderstanding, Lord, you misunderstood. It's me. Lord Han hurriedly walked in from outside and bowed. It's all my fault for not teaching my son well. My son is naughty and mischievous and offended Lord Li. I hope you can forgive him and forgive him this time. Li Yi waved his hand and said, The one who misunderstood is Master Han. Speaking of which, it was I who disturbed your son, and caused him to be scalded by the hot water. I don't know how his injuries are, I hope Master Han won't blame me. How could it be, how could it be? Official Han repeatedly waved his hand, and breathed a sigh of relief in his heart. If that's the case, this lowly official will take his leave. Go. Li Yi waved his hand again. Since your son is injured, there is no harm in recuperating for 2 days. As for him talking about His Majesty behind His Majesty's back, we'll talk about it in 2 days. Hearing this, Sir Han's legs went soft and his forehead was covered in cold sweat. He anxiously said, Sir, it's a misunderstanding. It's all a misunderstanding. Even if my son was given the guts of the heavens, he wouldn't dare to talk about His Majesty. Don't worry, Sir Han. Since it's a misunderstanding, I believe the Intelligence Bureau will definitely clear your son's name. Intelligence Bureau. Sir Han's expression changed wildly. After muttering a few words, he slowly raised his head and said with some resentment, Sir Li, do you really want to exterminate my Han family? Do you think that without any evidence, just based on your one-sided words, His Majesty will believe it and go to great lengths to deal with my Han family? Whether His Majesty will believe it or not, don't you know in your heart, Sir Han? Thump. Sir Han's legs went soft and he knelt on the ground, crying out, Sir Li, spare me. Sir Han, you're leaving? Sung Shichen walked to the door of the room with the 2 wooden boxes in his arms, and happened to see Sir Han walking out. Sir Han's face was pale. He wiped the cold sweat on his forehead with his sleeve and said, There are still some matters in the yamen. I will take my leave first. Sorry for disturbing you today. After saying goodbye to Sir Han, Sung Shichen walked into the room, and handed the wooden box to Zuamo. When you've thought it through, you can come back to find me at any time. Zuamo opened the wooden box and looked inside, then closed it again. She stood up with the wooden box and bowed slightly. Thank you. She turned to look at Li Yi and whispered, Let's go back. Li Yi patted her hand. Sit here for a while. I have something to say to Sir Zue. He looked at Sung Shichen. Sir Zue, can we talk in private? Sung Shichen nodded, and the two went to a side hall. Li Yi casually cupped his hands. I haven't congratulated Sir Zue on your promotion to the capital governor. Sung Shichen cupped his hands in return. It's all thanks to Sir Li. If he still didn't know what Li Yi meant that day in the palace, then he would have lived all these years in vain. Since you know it's all thanks to me. Li Yi nodded. Then surely Sir Zue won't mind doing me a small favor? Although Sung Shichen had already guessed that this matter was related to him, he did not expect that he would not shirk away at all. After a moment of shock, Sung Shichen looked at him cautiously and asked, I wonder what Lord Li wants me to help with. Li Yi looked at him and asked, the capital governor has his own mansion, right? Although he didn't know what he meant, Sung Shichen nodded. The court has indeed built a mansion for the capital governor. It's in the yamen of the capital. After Sir Zue takes office, will you move to the capital governor's mansion? Sung Shichen looked at him suspiciously. What does Marquis Li mean? Just say it. Then I'll say it. Li Yi looked around, then turned his head and said, I want the Zung mansion. Li Yi looked at him with a burning gaze. I want you to move out. I want the Zung mansion. Sir Zue, name your price. What? Sung Shichen was stunned, then shook his head. That's impossible. This is the Zung family's ancestral mansion. How could we sell it to you? Besides, the capital governor's mansion is only a temporary residence. If there's a change of position, where do you want me to live? Sir Zue can buy another mansion. In any case, the Zung mansion's location isn't very good. Change the place, change the feng shui, and change the mood. Who knows? Maybe your luck will turn around and your career will be smoother. Li Yi looked at him and said, there are many good places in the capital. Why does Sir Zue need to guard this place? No, that's absolutely not possible. Sung Shichen shook his head and said resolutely, the ancestral mansion can't be abandoned easily. I spent a lot of effort to regain it. Please forgive me for not being able to help you. Li Yi sighed and said, Sir Zue, this is the first time I'm asking for your help. I'm powerless in this matter. Sir Zue, you know me. Li Yi looked at him and said with a smile, I'm the kind of person who will do anything to achieve my goals. Sung Shichen looked at him and asked, do you want to rob me if I don't agree? Sir Zue, don't joke around. Wouldn't that make you a robber? Li Yi shook his head and said, I'm a decent person. I won't do that kind of thing. How about I find a new place for you? I guarantee that it's better and safer than this place. Moreover, the Zung family definitely won't blame you. Sung Shichen had a bad premonition and asked, where? The Ministry of Justice's prison. What does Sir Zue think? If Sir Zue thinks the Ministry of Justice's prison isn't good, that's fine. There are also the Supreme Court's prison, and the Secret Intelligence Bureau's prison to choose from. However, I don't recommend going to the last one. It's easy to get in there, but difficult to get out. It should be much cheaper to buy this place from the Imperial Court. Sung Shichen's expression changed. What do you mean? When I was in the garden just now, I accidentally heard your son discussing state affairs with someone. I have to say, Sir Zue's family is quite good. Young Master Zung is very concerned about the state and the people, as well as His Majesty's health. He's especially worried about who will succeed His Majesty when he passes away in a year or two. That was clearly what that kid from the Han family said. I'm not sure about that. Li Yi shook his head and said, there's a screen outside, so how would I know who said it? But it doesn't matter. When the time comes, we'll find out. The Secret Intelligence Bureau is the best at these things. Sung Shichen looked at him and asked word by word. What use does the Zung family mansion have to you? Why are you so insistent? It's useless to me. Li Yi shook his head. But she likes it. Sung Shichen was stunned when he heard this, and his face quickly showed a look of realization. It's drunk ink. He shook his head and said, forget about the Ministry of Justice's prison. Find a better place. Li Yi shook his head and said, she doesn't know about this. Don't tell her yet, Sir Zue. Sung Shichen looked at him deeply and said, you have to let the Zung family have a good new year, right? Of course. Li nodded, thought for a moment and asked, can we get a 20% discount after the new year? Chapter 837. What did you just say? Zheng Zumo turned around and asked Li Yi curiously when they walked out of the Zheng mansion and strolled back to Willow Lane. Nothing. Li Yi shook his head and said, holding 2 wooden boxes. I asked Master Zheng what kind of dowry he planned to prepare for you. I haven't agreed yet. I don't care. Why are you so shameless? Why don't you like it? I like it. After entering the room and placing her parents' memorial tablets, Li Yi and she burned incense and sat on the bedside. She looked at the lit incense and murmured, at that time, the government said that my father embezzled the grain and sent people to arrest him. The Zheng family, they threw our things out of the house, saying that my father had done such a thing, so he was not a member of the Zheng family and should not be a burden to the Zheng family. She gradually tightened her grip on Li Yi's hand, and her voice became lower and lower. My mother committed suicide, my father was arrested by the government, and I was also taken away by them to the musical house. The musical house. It sounds nice, but no one knows what kind of place it is. Several sisters I met in it died soon after. I remember one time, I only ate a moldy steamed bun for 3 days. At that time, I was so afraid that one day I would be like them. It's all in the past, all in the past. Li put his arm around her shoulder and gently stroked her hair, with a trace of tenderness in his eyes. It was no wonder that she was always so secretive about her previous experiences. The things that she had suffered during that period of time, if it was anyone else, they would not be willing to easily mention it. Her eyes were slightly absent-minded, and she murmured, later, my mother bought me from the musical house and brought me to the Qing'an mansion. At that time, I swore that I would never come back to this place in my life. Li lowered his head and asked softly, then why did you come back? Because Sister Ruoqing is here. She turned her head to look at Li Yi and said, because you are also here. Li Yi pinched her nose and said, so you had been thinking about me since then? Thank you. She leaned comfortably in Li Yi's arms, closed her eyes, and let out a long sigh. Li Yi asked in surprise, what are you thanking me for? Yes, thank you. There's not much sincerity in just saying thank you. Before Li Yi could finish his words, 2 soft lips were imprinted on him. Today's weather was good. Even people's moods couldn't help but become better. They couldn't help but think of some happy things. Walking out of Willow Lane, he saw Feng beside the carriage. Li Yi was surprised and asked, why are you here? When I passed by just now, I saw the carriage and guessed that the son-in-law must be here. Feng straightened up and asked, are we going home now? I'm not going back yet. Li Yi shook his head and said, send someone to the Zheng residence to hand over an invitation and invite Zheng Shichen out. Just now, Zui Mo was also at the Zheng residence, so it wasn't appropriate to ask too much. But since everything had been said today, he naturally couldn't pretend that he didn't know some things. Okay, I'll send someone right away. Feng jumped off the carriage and turned back to say, son-in-law, let me remind you, when you go back today, don't smile like you did just now. Like what? Like when you walked out of Willow Lane. Li raised his eyebrows and asked, why? Because. Feng opened his mouth and shook his head. Anyway, as long as the son-in-law remembers what I said. Strange. Li glanced at him and said to the sloppy old man, go to the tea house closest to the Zheng residence. In the tea house, Zheng Shichen seemed to be in better spirits than before, and the smell of alcohol had mostly dissipated. Before sitting down, he hurriedly asked, is there anything else important? Li Yi poured a cup of tea and asked, I want to know about Zui Mo's father. What kind of case was he involved in back then? Zheng Shichen paused, and the hand that reached for the teacup retracted. He said in a low voice, they framed him for embezzling the grain and delayed the battle, which was an important reason for the defeat of a certain war with the Qi kingdom. Li frowned and asked, with your ability, you haven't found anything after so many years? Zheng Shichen shook his head. There are many people who know that Big Brother was framed, but none of them really stood out and were willing to vindicate him. Even if they found out, the only person who could be found in this case was the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue at that time. If we continue to investigate, it will do more harm than good. Besides, it has been so long, there is no way to investigate. Li thought for a moment, looked at him and asked, "What about the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue at that time?" Later, because of corruption, he was exiled with his whole family. Since it was an exile, there are traces to follow. Sung Shichen shook his head and said, "We can't follow them." At this point, there was no need to continue. Li glanced at Sung Shichen, shook his head slightly and said, "We still have to investigate. There is no truth that can't be found out. Otherwise, you wouldn't have said those words today." Sung Shichen was silent. After a moment, he raised his head and looked at Li Yi saying, "I'll leave this matter to you. It's not a request. Even if you don't, I must do it." Li Yi shook his head and said, "Regarding this matter, you definitely have more information than I do. Another day, invite Assistant Minister Liu of the Ministry of Justice to a meal. We still have to rely on him for this matter. Also regarding the Zeng family's mansion." Sung Shichen waved his hand and said, "That mansion, if you want it, you can have it. The Zeng family is no longer the original Zeng family. There is no point in keeping that mansion. In comparison, Zuemo needs it more." Li looked at him and said, "There are still a few months before Zuemo's birthday. I want to give the Zeng family mansion as a gift to her. Lord Zeng shouldn't forget what the Zeng family was like 13 years ago, right?" "Of course I won't forget. Every flower and grass, every wood and stone of the Zeng family, they are all." He glanced at Li Yi, nodded slightly and said, "You are thoughtful. When the time comes, I will have to trouble Lord Zeng." Li Yi stood up and said, "Her Royal Highness values Lord Zeng very much. Lord Zeng should stay close to the virtuous officials and stay away from the evil ones. In the future, you will definitely have a bright future." Sung Shichen naturally knew what this sentence meant. He said calmly, "County Marquis Li, please tell Her Royal Highness that I will not let her down. In addition, thank you for the transfer of the capital governor. This is Her Royal Highness's wish. It has nothing to do with me." Li Yi waved his hand and walked to the door. Watching him walk out and disappear, Sung Shichen murmured in a voice that only he could hear, "Isn't your wish the princess's?" Li Yi's figure appeared at the door again. He glanced at Sung Shichen and said lightly, "Lord Zeng, you will be the capital governor soon. Be careful with your words." There was no need to worry about the Zeng family for the time being. Not to mention others, Sung Shichen still had some conscience. Although Zuemo didn't show it on the surface, he was her second uncle after all. She still had some hope in her heart. Speaking of which, after returning from the Zeng family, she seemed to be more open. This was a good sign. Thinking of the kiss during the day, Li couldn't help but smile. "What are you thinking about? Why are you so happy?" Mississippi Lu looked at him and asked with her arms crossed in front of her chest. When Li was thinking about why he was so happy, Mississippi Lu suddenly took a step forward and reached out to his chest. "What are you doing?" Li asked warily. She had retracted her hand and pinched a strand of long black hair between her fingers. She looked at him and asked, "Whose hair is it?" Such as, Li suddenly remembered that Rui went out early in the morning at the invitation of the princess, and Xiaohuan naturally went with her. Proud Lolita's hair didn't have such long hair, not to mention Yong Ning's. He couldn't say it was Fang's, could he? And this matter was not suitable for Mississippi Lu to know for the time being. "I don't know." Li looked surprised and looked at her and said, "Why don't you guess?" Chapter 838. Seeing that Mississippi Lu had no intention of guessing, Li asked tentatively, "Do you think Li Xian's hair is this long?" Mississippi Lu glanced at him and said, "I already know everything." "What, you already know everything?" Li looked at her in surprise. Could it be that Rui had already told her about it? He had thought that Rui would strongly object to it, but he did not expect her to be so understanding. Li nodded and said, "Since you already know, then it's fine. She doesn't want to leave Willow Lane for now, but she will enter the residence sooner or later. When that time comes, Princess Shining is no longer a child. There is a difference between men and women. Even if she is close to you, there should be a boundary. Mississippi Lou paused and looked at Lee. She raised an eyebrow and asked, Willow Lane, enter the residence. Who are you talking about? What do you mean? You mean Shining? Lee stood rooted to the ground for a long time before he stood up and looked at her. Are you hungry? Do you want me to cook a bowl of noodles for you? Mississippi Lou nodded and said, a little. Go ahead. What Willow Lane? What entering the residence? We'll talk about it while we eat. Oh yes, remember to add more vegetables and vinegar. The Spring Festival was a very joyous occasion. No matter how much hardship and exhaustion one had endured in the past year, in the short month between the end of the year and the Lantern Festival, one would always unload the heavy burden on one's shoulders and spend a few comfortable days with the family. However, these days, Lee did not have a good time. The little fellow was almost 2 months old. He could barely make sounds of oh. He was no longer as sleepy as before. While he became more active, he naturally became more restless. Rui did not ask a wet nurse or a maid to take care of the child. He got up in the middle of the night and cried a lot. These days, the two of them rarely had a good sleep. Mississippi Lou had not spoken to him for a few days because of that important matter. She kept a straight face and was cold. They hadn't even entered the residence yet. When that time came, just thinking about it gave her a headache. At the end of the year, the court meeting was approaching. All the officials were coming to the capital. The princess had a lot of things to do and hadn't seen her for a few days. He didn't have much time either. He didn't have to worry about the brothel and the shop. But at the end of the year, there were many things that he needed to see for himself. Seeing that it was New Year's Eve, he must still spend this year at home. Next year, he might be able to bring Zuemo and Ruaching over. The whole family could make dumplings and stay up for the new year together. Of course, for now it was just a thought. After coaxing the little fellow to sleep again, Lee walked out of the room tiredly. Looking at the moon in the sky that was missing a corner, he murmured, "It's still missing something." After entering the 12th month, especially when it was getting closer and closer to the new year, the entire capital gradually became more lively and prosperous. The big families had to prepare for the celebration, and the ordinary people also had to buy the New Year's goods. All the big shops were overcrowded. The small merchants and peddlers also seized the only opportunity of the year, thinking of making a lot of money at the end of the year. The streets were crowded, and pedestrians could only walk slowly. At the gate of the city, a huge fleet of carriages slowly entered after being inspected by the guards at the gate. At the forefront, a tall man looked back at the towering city wall, and then looked at the endless tide of people in front of him and the row upon row of shops. He turned his head and said, "Miss, the capital of the Jing Kingdom is much more prosperous than the last time we came here." The woman nodded and said, "Wait until we put the goods in the official warehouse first. Then we can take our time to see." When the fleet of carriages turned and went to another road with fewer people, many people sighed aloud. Other people pay 30% tax to 1%, but when it comes to us, it becomes 10% tax to 1%. This is a total difference of 2 times. When we go back this time, I'm afraid it will be very good if we can keep our capital. Alright, there's nothing to complain about. 30% tax to 1% is for the merchants of the Jing Kingdom. We'd better not think too much. Wasn't it 30% tax to 1% before, but this year? Alas, who asked us to lose the war? After this trip, we'd better stay in the Qi Kingdom obediently. Don't take this risk easily. A low-ranking official led the fleet of carriages to the front of a government office and shouted, "There's work. Come out and receive the goods." Immediately, a man ran out from the duty room. The low-ranking official glanced at him and said, "These are the peddling merchants of the Qi Kingdom. I'll leave them to you." Then he turned and left. "Aren't you just a doorkeeper? What's there to be so arrogant about?" The bailiff glanced at him, then turned his eyes to the crowd and waved his hand. "All of you, stand over there." Although this was only a bailiff from a small government office, none of them dared to disobey him. They stood obediently to the side. These peddling merchants were different from the merchants who owned shops here. After entering the city, They had to first register their goods in the official warehouse and pay the taxes before they could enter the market to be sold. As for the merchants from the Qi kingdom, they were different from the local peddling merchants of the Jing kingdom. In comparison, they were often ostracized and treated unfairly. 10% tax to 1%, so be it. The perfumes and ready-made clothes from the capital city of the Jing kingdom are very famous. They're very popular even in the Qi kingdom. If we trade these things back, it'll be profitable. I've heard that the women's personal belongings they sell are also very profitable. The biggest profit should be Liuli. What a pity! What a pity for those damned foreign merchants. Alas, let's not talk about it. The winter weather was still a little cold. The crowd stood outside for about 2 hours before someone came out again. Thank you, Your Excellency. A man went up to greet the bailiff with a respectful expression. After receiving the tax receipt, he glanced at it, and his expression froze in an instant. He raised his head in disbelief and asked, Your Excellency, is there a mistake in the calculation? The bailiff waved his hand and said impatiently, For people like you who seek personal gain, 5% tax to 1% is already too little. Pay the tax quickly and don't leave your things there and take up space. Your Excellency, this is really too much. You can't. If you think it's too much, then you can take it back. The bailiff glanced at him and said indifferently before turning to leave. They were just a few merchants from the Qi kingdom. Didn't they see where they were? Was this a place where they could bargain? Outside the yamen, the man leaned against the wall and cursed. These black-hearted dogs, they're clearly trying to bully us. Lower your voice. The woman glanced at him and said, This is the Jing kingdom. We live under the eaves. It's better to suffer a little than to lose everything. The man nodded gloomily and asked, Then, miss, what should we do now? The woman thought for a moment and said, Let's find a place to settle down first. The man's face revealed an excited expression. He licked his lips and said, Why don't we go find the Li brothers? Didn't Li brothers say that we should go find him when we come to the capital? I haven't seen him for more than half a year, and I really miss him. The woman looked at him and shook her head. Let's find an inn first. We can ask around later. She looked at the crowded streets and murmured, Since we're here, we should meet him. Chapter 839. So this is the home of the Li brothers. How extravagant. Lin Yong couldn't help saying as he stood in front of a mansion and looked up. The woman beside him glanced at him and said, Don't call him that when you go in. This is not the Qi kingdom, and he's no longer the accountant of the Lin family. You have to know your place. Don't worry, Mississippi. I know that. Lin Yong nodded and walked toward the door. When Fong and Li walked out, he couldn't help saying, Young master, I think you should apologize to second miss about this. You shouldn't hide such an important thing from her. It's normal for her to be angry with you. Does that mean that sister-in-law Fong already knows about Xiao Hong? That's different. Second miss is not. Fong opened his mouth and shook his head. Forget it. It's the same. But I still think it's your fault. Li nodded. I know. It's my fault. I'll talk to her. Li brothers. As soon as he finished speaking, he heard a voice. Generally speaking, people would only address him as young master, Lord Li, County Marquis Li, and those who were more familiar with him, like Li Xian, never addressed him as Li brothers. It had been a long time since he heard them address each other as such. Li Yi raised his head. When he saw the man standing at the door with a surprised face, he was stunned at first, and then his face showed surprise and delight. Brother Lin, why are you here? Lin Yong smiled and said, I came here with Miss to do business, so I came to see you. It's the spring festival, but you're still so tired. He generously gave him a bear hug and asked, Where's Miss Lin? Lin Yong turned around and pointed to the back. Over there. I was just about to send someone in to inform her, and you came out. Gazing outside, Li Yi quickly walked over. That woman smiled at him and extended her hand. Long time no see. Long time no see. Li Yi smiled and nodded. Then he looked at her outstretched hand and asked, This is... Lin Wanru looked at him in surprise and asked, A handshake? Isn't that the etiquette here? Oh, that's right, that's right. Li came to a sudden realization. He reached out his hand and touched her palm gently. He asked tentatively, "You guys didn't greet everyone like this all the way here, right?" Lin Wanru shook her head. "You're the first." That's good, that's good." Li nodded and said, "This handshake is actually a lost etiquette in my hometown. No one uses it anymore. So if you meet someone in the future, just salute normally." "I got it." Lin Wanru looked at him meaningfully and nodded. Then she looked up at him and asked, "The handshake in your hometown, do you need to shake for so long?" This depends on how long we've been apart. We haven't seen each other for more than half a year, so we should shake for a longer time." Li naturally let go of her hand and said, "Don't stand outside anymore. Go in quickly." Then he turned around and waved at Fong. "By the way, Fong, go and inform eldest miss that a distinguished guest has arrived." When they walked into the mansion, Li turned his head and asked her, "It's almost the spring festival. Why did you come at this time?" "We're doing business. There's no difference whether we celebrate the spring festival or not." Lin Wanru smiled and said, "The closer it is to the spring festival, the busier I am. In the past, I rarely stayed at home. It's just that I've traveled a little further this year." This was far more than just a little further. If it were a caravan, it would take at least a few months to travel from the Qi Kingdom. This round trip would take at least half a year on the road. Rui came out to welcome them. She first bowed to Lin Wanru, then looked at Li and asked, "Husband, this young lady is," Li introduced. "This is Lin Wanru, Miss Lin, whom I've often mentioned to you. When Rui and I were in the Qi Kingdom, it was thanks to Miss Lin's care." "So this is Miss Lin." Rui held her hand and said, "When husband and Rui were stranded in the Qi Kingdom, it was thanks to Miss Lin's care. I've always wanted to thank you. This time, I finally have the chance. Come in." A smile appeared on Lin Wanru's face. "Madam Li, you're too polite." Watching them walk in hand, Li looked left and right and asked, "Where's Rui?" During her time in the Qi Kingdom, Mississippi Lu only had Lin Wanru as a friend. He believed that Mississippi Lu would be very happy to see her again. A servant girl said, "Second miss should be in her room." "Go and call her," Li said, then waved his hand and said, "Forget it, I'll go there myself." He couldn't keep the Cold War with Mississippi Lu. There had to be someone who spoke first. Generally speaking, this person could only be him. From afar, he saw Xiao Huan sitting in the corridor in front of Mississippi Lu's room. Li walked over and asked, "Is second miss inside?" The little servant girl nodded. Li habitually rubbed her head and walked inside. "Hey, son-in-law." Xiao Huan immediately called out to him. "What's wrong?" Li turned around and asked in confusion. "Is there anything else?" The little servant girl rolled her eyes and bit her lips. Then she said with a smile, "Nothing, son-in-law, please go in." With the lesson from last time, Li first knocked on the door. When he heard the voice come in, he pushed the door open and walked in. After closing the door and turning around, he was immediately stunned. This time, it wasn't because he saw something he shouldn't have seen. To be exact, he didn't see anything this time. The room was filled with water vapor, blocking his vision. In addition, there was a faint fragrance. A surprised expression appeared on Li Yi's face. This cloud of mist, could it be that she was secretly cultivating in the room? "Xiao Huan, help me add some more hot water." When Mississippi Lu's voice came out of the mist, Li finally realized what had happened. He cleared his throat and asked, "There's an important guest at home. Do you want to go out and meet him?" The voice in the mist paused for a moment before it came again. "Go out." Li decisively turned around without any hesitation. When he closed the door, he carefully asked, "Do you still want more hot water?" When he walked into the courtyard, he saw the little servant girl still standing there. Before he could speak, Xiao Huan held her stomach and said with a bitter face, "Son-in-law, my stomach hurts. I'll go back to my room first." Seeing her quickly slip away, Li said in surprise, "Stomach hurts? It shouldn't be these few days." He looked back at the door of Mississippi Lu's room and decided to stand there and wait for her. Not long after, Mississippi Lu, who had changed into a new set of clothes, walked out from inside. She didn't mention what had happened just now. Instead, she looked at Li Yi and said calmly, "She's here?" Li Yi was stunned when he heard this. No way, she could even guess this? Seeing Li Yi's expression, her eyes flickered and she asked again, "The painting hidden in your study is her, right? Have you known each other for a long time?" "Ah, when I kidnapped you up the mountain. I was the one who separated you. If it wasn't for me, you and she would have. Sister doesn't care, so I have no reason to object." Mississippi Lou looked at him and said, "But you shouldn't hide this from me. Next time, if you hide it from me like this, I'll ignore you forever." "Ah. What ah?" She took a deep breath and said, "Let's go and meet the second wife of the Li residence." "What second wife?" Li looked at her in surprise and said, "Miss Lin has come to the capital. I came to call you and bring you to see her." "What are you talking about?" "Ah. What ah? What did you mean by what you said just now?" Mississippi Lou was stunned on the spot. After a moment, she waved her hand and said lightly, "Nothing, let's go." When walking with her, Li Yi seemed to understand something. He suddenly stopped and looked at her. He promised, "Don't worry, next time. I won't hide it from you, I swear." Chapter 840. Mississippi Lou turned to look at him. "How many more times do you want to do it?" "Only a few times." Li Yi secretly counted his fingers and then urged, "Let's go quickly. Don't let Miss Lin and the others wait too long." The friendship between women always came very quickly. By the time he and Mississippi Lou walked over, Lin Wanru and Rui were already calling each other Sister Lou and Sister Lin. After Mississippi Lou went over, there was even less for him to do. He walked over and asked Lin Yong, "When did you arrive in the capital? Where are you staying now?" Lin Yong replied, "We just arrived yesterday and found a random inn to stay in." Li shook his head and said, "Since you're already in the capital, it's not appropriate to stay in an inn. Which inn are you staying in? I'll ask someone to help you pack your things and move in today." Lin Yong rubbed his hands. "That's so embarrassing." Rui and Lin Wanru walked out of the room and said, "Husband, there are many empty guest rooms at home. During this time, let Sister Lin move in so that she can take care of you." "That's what I mean too." Li nodded and walked over. He looked at Lin Wanru and said, "Miss Lin, which inn are you staying in? I'll ask someone to help you pack your things." "There's no need to go through so much trouble." "It's no trouble at all. Didn't we trouble you a lot back then?" Okay then." Lin Wanru said a few words and finally nodded in agreement. It would take some time to pack, so they didn't stay at home for long. They asked Feng to call 2 guards from the mansion to help. Li Yi originally planned to go out, so he naturally needed to accompany them when he met them. At the entrance of an inn in the capital, several figures were anxiously pacing. "Tell me, where did Miss Lin go at such an important time? The goods are still being held by them. If anything happens to the goods, our trip will be in vain." What should we do now? The officials of the Jing Kingdom are really going too far in their bullying." The few merchants of the Qi Kingdom were anxious. In the past, the Qi Kingdom and the Jing Kingdom were enemies as well. However, the Qi Kingdom was very powerful. When they were doing business in the Jing Kingdom, they would not encounter too many obstacles. On the contrary, the Jing Kingdom would deliberately make things convenient for them. However, it was different now. The situation in the Jing Kingdom had reversed in the past 2 years. Their situation had suddenly become very difficult. "Hey, Miss Lin is back." Someone shouted. The crowd crowded around her and asked anxiously, "Miss Lin, what should we do about this matter? Please give us a definite answer." Although Miss Lin was young, her family's business was very big. Her background was also very strong. She was the leader of the caravan on this trip. Li Yi asked in surprise, "What happened?" Lin Yong said gloomily, "It's all because of those black-hearted people in the treasury. The taxes are 5% and 1%. If we pay the money, our trip will be in vain." "The treasury?" After listening to Lin Yong's description of the matter, Li waved his hand and said, "The imperial court would not normally impose such a heavy tax. It must be the people at the bottom who are deliberately making things difficult for you. After all, you are from the Qi Kingdom. Even if they really make things difficult for you, you have no way to reason with them. The merchants from the Qi Kingdom were speechless. Thinking back to 2 years ago, they had been so proud to be citizens of Qi. Less than 2 years later, they had been reduced to being bullied by a petty official. But this 1% tax is indeed a bit too much. Li Yi knew what was going on. He waved his hand and said, "Let's go. Let's settle this matter first." Lin Wanru grabbed his sleeve and asked, "Will it cause you trouble?" "What's the trouble?" Li Yi smiled and said, "Anyway, there's nothing urgent. Let's go to the Ministry of Revenue and have a cup of tea. Do you want to wait here or come with me?" Lin Wanru thought for a moment and nodded. "I'll go with you." "I'll go too," Lin Yong immediately said. "Who is that?" Watching the three leave, one of the merchants from the Qi Kingdom turned his head and asked the person behind him in confusion. "I don't know." The accompanying Lin family shopkeeper was also at a loss. He had never heard that Miss knew any important people in the Jing Kingdom. But that person just now, why did he look so familiar? The merchants from the Qi Kingdom looked in a certain direction at the same time. Their hearts were filled with anxiety and anticipation. Now they could only place all their hopes on this. On the street, Lin Yong asked in surprise, "Li brothers, why are we not going to the official warehouse but to the Ministry of Revenue Yamen?" When it comes to collecting taxes, the Ministry of Revenue is still in charge. It will be more effective to find an official from the Ministry of Revenue, Li Yi explained. More importantly, the Ministry of Revenue Yamen is closer. It was also Li Yi's first time coming to the Ministry of Revenue Yamen. After stating his identity, someone immediately went in to pass on the message. The three of them had just entered the courtyard when someone quickly ran out from one of the duty rooms. When that person ran down the steps, he almost tripped. Without even straightening his official robes, he said in a panic, "Lord Li." Li patted him on the shoulder and asked, "Dr. Han, don't panic. Are Minister Qin and Assistant Minister Zeng here?" Dr. Han said in fear and trepidation, "The two lords are not in the Yamen at the moment. May I ask what Lord Li needs? Can this lowly official be of service?" This was a small matter, and Li Yi thought that this Minister of Revenue would be able to handle it as well. Thus Li Yi briefly explained the matter to him. "Don't worry, my lord. This lowly official will immediately send someone. No, this lowly official will personally ask." Seeing that Lord Li was not here to cause trouble, Minister Han immediately relaxed and respectfully spoke. He immediately waved his hand at a lowly official. "What are you standing there for? Hurry up and serve Lord Li some tea." "There's no need." Li Yi waved his hand and said, "I still have matters to attend to, so I'll be leaving first. Dr. Han, please take care of this matter as soon as possible." Dr. Han immediately bowed. "This lowly official will see you off, Lord Li." After walking out of the Ministry of Revenue Yamen, Lin Yong asked in surprise, "Li brothers, I feel like that doctor just now was very afraid of you. You must have seen wrongly." Li looked at him and asked, "Am I that scary?" Lin Wanru glanced at him and didn't say anything. "That's true." Lin Yong nodded and asked, "Then where are we going now?" Li thought about it and said, "It will take a while to clean up both sides. Have you eaten yet? Do you want to find a place to eat first?" Lin Yong shook his head and said, "We haven't eaten anything since morning." Li Yi turned his head and asked, "Then let's eat first. What do you think, Miss Lin?" Lin Wanru nodded in agreement. Li Yi looked up and pointed to the restaurant in front of them. He said, "This is the place." After walking into the restaurant, a waiter quickly came over and looked at them. He said apologetically, "Dear guests, I'm sorry, but we are full now. There are no more seats. Would you like to wait for a while?" Lin Yong looked at the seats that were all filled and said, "Why don't we go somewhere else?" Li looked around and happened to meet the gaze of a table beside him. "Come, Brother Wu, let me toast you." Wei Junliang had just raised his wine cup and gestured to the young man opposite him when he suddenly sensed something and turned his head to look. Clatter! His hand involuntarily trembled, and the wine cup fell to the ground. His face began to pale. "I'm done eating. Let's go." He quickly stood up and walked out of the door with his head down. The dishes have just been served. I haven't eaten yet. Several young people showed surprise on their faces. When they looked over, they all stood up and left with Wei Junliang. Oh, what a coincidence. Isn't there a seat now? Lin Yang's face suddenly lit up. He patted the waiter's shoulder and said, "Come on, clean up that table." Lin Wanru looked back and then looked at Li Yi in surprise. She asked, "You know each other?" Among the young people at the table just now, there were indeed a few familiar faces, but she couldn't tell their names. Li Yi nodded and said, "I know them, but I'm not familiar with them. There are seats available. Let's go." Chapter 841. On the street, a few young people walked dejectedly. One of them furrowed his brows for a long time and finally couldn't help but ask, "Junliang Louis, what's wrong with you? You haven't even had 2 cups of wine, and the dishes have just arrived. Why are you leaving?" A young man sighed and said, "Ah, Chuping, don't ask too much. You don't know, in short, just leave." The young man called Chuping was slightly anxious and asked, "Just what happened? Tell me." The young man looked at the person beside him and said, "Junliang, you tell me." Chuping's gaze also turned to him. Wei Junliang shook his head and said, "Chuping, you've just returned to the capital, and there are some things you don't know. However, let me remind you, if you meet that person in the future, hide as far away as possible. If something really happens, your family won't be able to protect you." "Which person?" Chuping asked in confusion, then said, "The person we met in the restaurant just now? Who is he?" "Li." Wei Junliang patted his shoulder and said, "Remember this name, His Highness the King of Shu, Duke Qin, Royal Prince Duanyang. In the younger generation of the capital, countless people have suffered at his hands. And it's not just the younger generation. In short, remember my words, do not provoke him." After hearing about that person's deeds from Wei Junliang, Chuping's heart was greatly shaken. However, he still curled his lips and pretended to be disdainful. "So what? This is the capital, under the feet of the emperor. We didn't provoke him. He acts so arrogantly. Even if His Majesty cares for him and can temporarily protect him, can he stop the mouths of the people of the world? Chuping, the way you speak is exactly the same as Grand Tutor Chu. No wonder you were personally taught by him." Wei Junliang said with a smile, "I still remember how he lectured us back then." "Of course." Chuping's face revealed an expression of pride. "I, Chuping, am filled with righteousness. I am worthy of neither the heavens nor the earth. Why would I fear a sycophant? Chuping, I know you have awe-inspiring righteousness." Wei Junliang laughed out loud and said, "No matter what, I finally had the chance to have a meal with you today, but I ruined my mood. How about this? I will set up a new banquet at the wonderful Sound Pavilion tonight. You must give me face." Immediately someone laughed and said, "You chose the wonderful Sound Pavilion. I'm afraid it's not as simple as just eating, right?" Chuping said in surprise, "Wonderful Sound Pavilion? This place sounds like a music hall. Could it be that there are some mysteries here?" That person walked to his side and whispered a few words. Chuping's expression immediately changed, and he hurriedly said, No, if Grandpa finds out that I went to that kind of place, he'll beat me to death." Alas, this wonderful Sound Pavilion is a place of entertainment. Could it be that the Lord Imperial Tutor is overthinking things? Chuping hesitated and asked, "Are you sure no one will know about this?" That person smiled and said, "Apart from heaven and earth, there is only you and me." A smile appeared on Chuping's face as he said, "I just want to listen to music and have a meal. I will definitely go. In the restaurant, seeing that Lin Wanru had also put down her chopsticks, Li opened his mouth and said, "Let's go. The matters over there should be more or less settled." The sloppy old man's toothache hadn't healed yet, so he could only eat porridge for now. Fong ran between the 2 places every day, so he didn't know how many meals he had to eat. "Wait a moment, one last mouthful. Lin Yong hurriedly said as he drank the last mouthful of soup in his cup. Only then did he burp and stand up while rubbing his stomach. Lin Wanru blushed slightly. She secretly glared at him before nodding and standing up. The two chatted as they walked back. Li asked a few things about the Lin family's business. In Feng Province, with the backing of the third prince and the Qian family, the Lin family had once again taken a few steps forward in just half a year. Although it hadn't reached the level of a top wealthy family, it was already a long time ago. For example, the Bai family and the Ma family, which used to be on the same level as the Lin family, could now only become the vassals of the Lin family. Since the price of colored glass had plummeted, they could only rely on the Lin family to barely survive. Lin Wanru looked at the row upon row of streets on both sides of the street, thought for a moment and said, "If it's just jewelry, it may be the end soon. This time, the main reason I came here is actually to visit the capital of the Jing Kingdom. The ready-made clothes, perfume, liquor, are all very popular in the Qi Kingdom. Unfortunately, I can only bring them in this way, and the price is very high. If I can directly reach an agreement with them and build the workshop in the Qi Kingdom, I can reduce more than 70% of the cost." She paused and said, "However, I heard that these shops all have the shadow of the royal family behind them. I'm afraid it's unlikely." "That's not necessarily true." Li shook his head and said, "Everything is possible." Lin Yong interrupted, "It's not easy to make perfume and liquor, but what's there to cooperate with about clothes? Just make it according to the original." Li glanced at him. If he were to do business in the future for another 1,000 years, he would definitely lose so much that even his underwear would not be left. However, for now, what he said was not wrong at all. Regardless of whether it was underwear or ready-made clothes, he wanted to first build up his reputation and reputation. This way, even if there were imitators in the future, they would not be too much of a threat. Lin Wanru also glanced at him, but did not say anything. If things were really that simple, ready-made clothes shops in the Qi Kingdom would have sprung up a long time ago. In fact, although there were countless people imitating the Jing Kingdom, the quality of the fabric and the style of the clothes were far from being comparable to the authentic products in the Jing Kingdom. Those shops sprung up like mushrooms after a spring rain, only to close down in a short period of time. Although Li did not say anything, Lin Wanru's words reminded him that if he were to cooperate with the Lin family, his own shop would soon be able to open in the Qi Kingdom. Although the Jing Kingdom was huge, there would always be a time when business would be saturated. The Qi Kingdom. This was a piece of land that had not been cultivated yet, and it was exceptionally fertile. It was just waiting for him and Miss Lin to sow the seeds. Thinking of this, Li tilted his head and asked, "Seriously, does the Lin family really intend to intervene in these businesses?" Lin Wanru nodded and said, "This is also one of the important reasons why I came to the capital this time." "Can you handle it? It shouldn't be a problem to hire more people." Feng looked at the two figures walking side by side in front of him and rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Li brothers." Lin Yong thought of something, and was about to step forward when someone pressed down on his shoulder. "Where are you going?" Feng asked in a low voice. "I have a question for the Li brothers." "What question?" Feng put his arm around his shoulder and said, "This brother is called Lin Yong, right? The son-in-law is very busy now, don't disturb him. If you have any questions, you can ask me." "I'm really sorry, this is all our negligence, and we've caused you trouble." At the entrance of the restaurant, Dr. Han said apologetically to the people opposite him, "Don't worry, we will definitely deal with this matter seriously. We will not tolerate those who are biased." We don't dare. A merchant from the Qi Kingdom looked at this official from the Jing Kingdom, and his face turned pale with fright. At a glance, he could tell that this official's status was much higher than the officials they had met along the way. He was actually speaking to them in such a polite manner. It really made them feel weak. From afar, he saw Lin Wanru walking over in front of him. Only then did he take a few quick steps forward and hurriedly say, "Miss Lin, this." Before Lin Wanru could react to what had happened, Li had already walked over and said, "This kind of matter can be handled by anyone. Why did Dr. Han come personally?" Dr. Han hurriedly said, "Lord Li, to tell you the truth, this lowly official is in charge of the official treasury. These days, the Ministry of Revenue has been busy and had no time to attend to other matters. I didn't think that these bastards would be so bold." Don't worry, Lord Li, this lowly official will definitely investigate this matter to the end. He then raised his head and said tentatively, this lowly official has already sent out all the goods, not a single one missing. I wonder if Lord Li, didn't you collect taxes? Afraid that he would anger this Lord Li, Dr. Han immediately shook his head. No, not a single coin was collected. How can this be? Li Yi shook his head. This tax was for the country, and for the country, it was for Emingzu, and for Emingzu, it was, in short, as a law-abiding citizen, he couldn't be given special treatment. Everything was done according to the law. Seeing Lord Li shake his head, Dr. Han's body trembled. Li patted his shoulder and said, the taxes that should be collected still have to be collected. Otherwise, how can the country's laws be respected? Dr. Han, you must be fair, you can't be biased. Hearing this, Dr. Han's face turned bitter, and his voice sounded like he was about to cry. He nodded repeatedly. Lord Li is right. This lowly official will collect them immediately. Chapter 842. In the Jing Kingdom, the merchants from the Qi Kingdom and those from the Jing Kingdom were naturally treated differently. It was normal for the merchants to be taxed twice as much. In fact, in the Qi Kingdom, the laws were even stricter when it came to merchants from other countries. However, even so, it was enough for the merchants of the Qi state to thank this young man from the Jing state endlessly. If it wasn't for him, they would have wasted more than half a year on this trip. Some of them would have even lost their entire family's wealth. At the same time, he secretly rejoiced in his heart. He rejoiced that he was following Miss Lin and not someone else. Thinking of the doctor's attitude just now, who would have thought that the Lin family was not only all-powerful in the kingdom of Qi, but also in the distant capital of the Jing Kingdom. Lin Wanru and Lin Yong went up to tidy up the room, and left the rest to the guards from the Li family. As for the shopkeepers and waiters from the Lin family, they stayed in the inn temporarily to deal with the goods brought from the Qi Kingdom. With nothing to do, Li turned to look at them and said, it's still early. Why don't I show you around the capital? Lin Wanru nodded without any hesitation and said, I knew that the capital is prosperous. Even the capital of the Qi Kingdom can't compare. Now that we're fated to meet, of course we have to take a good look. Sorry to trouble you. No need to stand on ceremony with us. Li Yi waved his hand and said, then let's go now. It's time to go back after walking around for more than 2 hours. The capital was the capital not only because it was the outskirts of the emperor, where the imperial city was located, and the center of power in the Jing Kingdom, but also because of its extremely prosperous commerce. For Lin Wanru and Lin Yong, there were too many things here that they couldn't see in the Qi Kingdom. For example, in the shops that sold women's personal items, there would occasionally be the figures of men. In such an environment, these people could still maintain a straight face, and from time to time, they would gossip with their female companions. Lin Yong watched as Li Yi walked in, and the man surnamed Fong followed him without any change in expression. Lin Yong then walked into the shop with relief. But soon after, he was dazzled by all kinds of colorful little objects that he had never seen before. He lowered his head, not daring to look again, and hurriedly retreated. Li Yi turned around and glanced at him. He wasn't surprised by Lin Yong's actions. In fact, even the majority of men in the capital city did not have the courage to step into a lingerie shop. Of course, in the past year, there had also been some people with avant-garde ideas and artistic hearts who wanted to use their discerning eyes to personally pick 1 or 2 pieces of clothing for their female companions. At this time, Lin Wanru was just a simple businesswoman. At the beginning, when Li Yi followed beside her and accompanied her to look at these women's lingerie, her face blushed for a moment, but it soon became natural. When she stopped beside a shelf, Li Yi asked, "How is it?" Lin Wanru was surprised and asked, "What do you mean, how is it?" "How I feel about this place." She was stunned for a moment, then looked around and said, "Be it the fabric or the weavers, they are all very high quality. Although there are many styles, each one is extremely beautiful. You can see that the designer of these things have put in a lot of effort. It's not surprising that they are popular and sought after by women all over the world." No wonder although there are so many people trying to imitate them, few succeed. Unless we reach an agreement with them, it will be very difficult to imitate them. Lin Wanru shook her head and said, "Let's go." Li nodded and then turned to look at a young girl behind them. He pointed to a few pieces of clothing that Lin Wanru's gaze had lingered on for a long time and ordered, "Wrap these up for this girl." Lin Wanru was stunned for a moment, then shook her head and said, "No need, I'll just look." Li waved his hand and said, "You're welcome. Speaking of which, I haven't officially given you anything yet. Since you're in the capital city, I have to do my part as a host. Don't refuse." Lin Wanru looked at him and said in surprise, "Is it also the custom of your hometown to give a girl these for the first time?" "This is not the point." Li shook his head and said, "In the past, when we were in the Qi Kingdom, it was always you who gave us things. This time, don't be polite with me." "Miss, it's done." The young girl smiled and handed over a cloth bag embroidered with a few willow leaves. Only then did Lin Wanru notice that in the shop, many women were carrying such bags in their hands. The material of this handbag was excellent, and it also looked good. No wonder the underwear here was so expensive. Just from the handbags they gave, it could be seen. Li Yi smiled at the young girl, then turned back and said, "Let's go out and look at the other things." "You haven't paid yet." Although Li Yi had said that this was a gift for her, Lin Wanru still took out her purse and was about to ask the young girl for the price. Li Yi, who was beside her, waved his hand lightly and said, "It's our own shop, no need to be polite." "Ah." The purse in Lin Wanru's hand almost fell to the ground. She looked at him in a daze and murmured, "This shop, is it your family's?" Ever since Lin Yong found out that the shop that sold women's underwear belonged to the Li brothers, he always had an illusion when he looked at him. It was as if there was a halo above his head. Women's underwear, bras, and other things were flying around the halo. Lin Wanru walked on the street and finally recovered from the shock of what had just happened. She said, "There's a tailor shop here." A moment later, she saw the young girl in the shop handing her a familiar handbag and the willow leaf on it. She turned to look at Li Yi and murmured, "This?" Li Yi looked at her and nodded. "You're welcome." Lin Wanru finally understood this time. As long as there was a willow leaf logo, there was no need to be polite. After walking halfway down the street, she discovered that not only the underwear shops, but also the cloth shops, perfume shops, soap shops, wine shops, confectionery shops, and even the Ru family inn where they had stayed yesterday, were also free to use. This even gave her the illusion that she didn't need to be polite when buying things in the entire capital. The Lin family had been merchants for generations and had been illustrious and glorious. She had seen many rich and powerful merchants, but even those people couldn't compare to the scene she saw with her own eyes today. "Miss, we've been walking for a long time. Should we find a place to rest?" Lin Yong looked around and her eyes suddenly lit up. "There's a brothel in front. Why don't we go inside and listen to a show? I heard that the shows in the Jing Kingdom's brothel are very exciting." Lin Wanru's mind was a bit confused at this moment. She wanted to find a place to properly sort out her thoughts. Moreover, Lin Yong's body was already full of things. Finding a place to rest would be good. She turned to look at Li Yi to ask for his opinion. Seeing Li Yi nod, she said, "That's fine. I've only heard about the Jing Kingdom's brothel. Today is a good opportunity to see it." After walking into the brothel, her footsteps paused. She seemed to have thought of something. She retreated outside and looked up. There was a beautiful willow leaf logo on top of her head. It was particularly eye-catching. "Go in. Whatever show you want to listen to." Li Yi walked over from behind and said, "You're welcome." Chapter 843. This is such a big place and it's all ours? Lin Yong was still not used to the feeling of renting out a theater. He looked down at the stage below, then looked left and right, and saw that there were no other customers besides them. There were all sorts of fruits and pastries on the table in front of them. He asked with uncertainty. Fong patted his shoulder, took a pear from the table, and took a bite. He said, "Don't look, no one else will come in." Li Yi had no intention of renting out the theater, but the scene that Lin Wanru had casually ordered was not scheduled today, so it could only be performed at the last minute. Li did not tell her either. After all, it was his family's brothel, and it was not a big deal to be a little extravagant once in a while. Lin Wanru took a sip of tea and looked down at the stage, but her mind was not there. She had known many things about him a long time ago. He was the #1 scholar in the Jing kingdom, and a favorite minister of the emperor. Before he had even reached the age of 20, he had risen from a commoner to a noble, and his glory was unparalleled. If not for the experience in the Qi kingdom half a year ago, given their status and position, perhaps they would never have met, and the things that had happened before would not have happened. Originally, she had thought that the distance between her and the accountant, who was proficient in mathematics and had a unique understanding of business, was very close. However, the appearance of the third prince later made her understand that there was an insurmountable gap between the two of them. After arriving at the capital, in less than a day's time, she had already heard many things about him. He was more powerful than she had imagined, and it also made her realize that things were not the same as they had been half a year ago. One was a foreign businessman, and the other was the youngest duke in the Jing kingdom. Perhaps even if they met, there would not be much to say between them. However, this thought was completely overturned when she saw him. Everything seemed to be the same as half a year ago. At this moment, after learning about these things, she was surprised to feel that the distance between the two of them seemed to be much closer than before. It was as if they suddenly had a common language, just like half a year ago. Li turned to look at Lin Wanru and asked, "You just said that the Lin family wants to get involved in industries other than jewelry. Is it true?" Lin Wanru nodded and said, "I started preparing a few months ago. This time, I came to the Jing kingdom to see more and learn more. I thought it would be best if I could cooperate with you on perfume and ready-made clothes, but I didn't expect." She looked at Li Yi and shook her head. "I didn't expect such a coincidence. Actually, a few days ago, I also thought that the business in the Jing kingdom would eventually reach saturation. I also had the idea of expanding these businesses to the Qi kingdom. But after all, it's a neighboring country, and the relationship between the two countries is so tense. If the merchants from the Jing kingdom were to go there, I'm afraid that they would encounter a lot of trouble and obstacles." He looked at Lin Wanru, wanting to say something but hesitated. How about? The two of them spoke almost at the same time and were stunned at the same time. When they looked at each other, they understood each other's thoughts. "It's a pleasure to cooperate with you." Li Yi smiled and reached out his hand. Lin Wanru also reached out and shook his hand without hesitation. "From now on, we're a family." "So soon?" Fong opened his eyes wide and looked at this scene in disbelief. The two figures who had just walked into the door of the private room stopped. Wanru looked puzzled. Zheng Zimo's eyes stopped on the two for a moment and she asked in a low voice, "Did I disturb you?" Li Yi and Lin Wanru looked back and were slightly stunned. Then they naturally let go of their hands. He shook his head and said with a sincere expression, "No, of course not." Lin Wanru looked at him, then looked at the two girls in front of her, and asked, "These two girls?" Li Yi stood up and introduced the two women to her before saying, "This is Lin Wanru, Miss Lin." The three women nodded slightly. Zheng Zimo looked at them and said, "We're just here to take a look. We won't disturb you." Her gaze swept across Li Yi's body. Then she left with a smile. "Sorry, I'll leave you for a moment." Li naturally saw the deep meaning in her eyes. He smiled apologetically at Lin Wanru and immediately followed her out. Lin Wanru looked at the figure disappearing at the door, and a thoughtful expression appeared on her face. Fong stood to the side and shook his head slightly when he saw the confusion and thought on her face. Somewhere in the brothel, in a room on the second floor, seeing Li Yi walk in, Ruoqing quietly left and gently closed the door. The Luo Shui goddess was flipping through a picture book. Li Yi explained, "This is Miss Lin. You don't need to explain anything." Zheng Zimo rolled her eyes and said, "It has nothing to do with me anyway." Li Yi sat beside her and said, "How can it have nothing to do with you? If it weren't for Miss Lin, you wouldn't have seen me a long time ago." Confusion and worry immediately appeared on her face. "Why? What happened?" Li briefly told her what happened in the Qi Kingdom. If it weren't for her, he and Mississippi Lu would be in a much more dangerous situation. What about the family you mentioned just now? Miss Lin's family is in business. This time, I plan to sell perfume and ready-made clothes to the Qi Kingdom, so I can only cooperate with Miss Lin. In the future, the two families will benefit each other. If we aren't family, what are we? Then why? Why are you holding hands? It's a kind of etiquette to show that the cooperation has been achieved. Besides, Fang is still here. How can it be like that? Zheng Zimo glanced at him and said, Then why didn't you tell me earlier? You didn't give me a chance just now. Li looked at her and asked with a smile. What's wrong? Jealous? She rolled her eyes again. Who's jealous? Don't worry. My relationship with Miss Lin is still very pure. It's not like what you think. Li put his arm around her shoulder and said, But I quite like it when you're jealous. I'm not. Her face was a little red. Then, as if remembering something, she hurriedly stood up and said, Oh no, she's your savior. Was I a little impolite just now? So you know that you were impolite. I thought you. Oh, anyway, it's all your fault. She glared at Li and then quickly ran out. Li shook his head. At this moment, she must have gone to cultivate her relationship with Miss Lin. It was not very suitable for him to appear. His business was developing towards the Qi Kingdom, and the Lin family was undoubtedly the best partner. However, the specific cooperation method still needed to be discussed slowly. At least for now, the two of them had reached an agreement. There was still a long way to go. She still had to stay in the capital for a long time, so there was enough time to discuss. There was a pen and paper on the table in the room. Since he had nothing to do, he walked over and sat down, ready to write down some preliminary ideas. This was Ruoqing's room. The room was clean and tidy. There was a thick pile of books on the table, most of which were scripts. On one of the open pages there were her comments. The pleasing hairpin-style small regular script was just like her. At first glance, it gave people a feeling of delicacy and elegance. The ink was still wet, so he couldn't close the book directly. There was no extra space on the table. Li looked around but couldn't find any space. He had to open the drawer next to the table and put the open book in it horizontally. The size was just right. When he closed the drawer, his hand paused, and a surprised expression appeared on his face. Then he took out the book again. In addition to the book he took out, there was only a thick booklet in the drawer, and some yellowed paper under the booklet. Li subconsciously reached out his hand, but stopped in midair. Since she put it in the drawer alone, it might be something very secretive or important. He just touched other people's things without their permission. It seemed maybe not so good. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.